Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of the Wasatch Mountains, Utah, 3 miles north of the abandoned mining town of Alta, in a place the locals call Devil's Throat Canyon. I should have listened to the warning signs. Should have paid attention when our GPS started glitching the moment we left the main trail. Should have turned back when Jake Morrison's dog, Ranger, a normally fearless German Shepherd, began whimpering and refused to cross the creek that marked the canyon's entrance. But we were 5 corporate accountants from Denver on our annual team-building retreat, eager to prove we weren't just pencil pushers who crumbled at the first sign of real wilderness. Our group consisted of myself, Jake Morrison, my closest friend since college and the one who'd organized this whole trip, Sarah Chen, sharp-tongued and competitive, always trying to prove she belonged in our boys' club, Derek Hawthorne, quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who planned everything down to the last detail, and Tommy Vasquez, the office joker who never took anything seriously. We'd been working together at Pinnacle Financial for 3 years, and Jake thought roughing it in the Utah wilderness would help us bond outside the sterile office environment. The first day went well enough. We hiked 6 miles into Devil's Throat Canyon, following what Derek's topographical maps showed as an old mining trail. The scenery was breathtaking. Towering red sandstone cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of storm clouds, stands of aspen trees that whispered secrets in languages we couldn't understand, and a crystal-clear stream that carved through the canyon floor like a silver ribbon. We made camp in a small clearing beside the stream, about 50 yards from where the canyon walls narrowed into what looked like a throat. Hence the name, Jake explained. The spot felt protected, surrounded by massive boulders that would shield us from wind. Derek, ever the planner, had us set up camp in a perfect circle with the fire pit at the center and our tents arranged like spokes on a wheel. "This is perfect," Sarah said, dropping her heavy pack with obvious relief. No cell service, no emails, no deadlines. Just us and nature. Tommy was already gathering firewood, cracking jokes about bears and making deliverance references that made us all laugh nervously. Ranger explored the perimeter of our camp, occasionally stopping to sniff at something that made his hackles rise, but Jake assured us it was probably just unfamiliar animal scents. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sandstone cliffs blood red, we built a roaring fire and shared stories over freeze-dried beef stew and whiskey from Derek's flask. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, and we huddled closer to the fire, watching sparks spiral up toward stars that seemed impossibly bright in the unpolluted darkness. "You know," Derek said, consulting his maps by firelight, "according to this, we're sitting pretty close to where the Donner Party supposedly took a wrong turn." "Jesus. Derek," Tommy laughed. "Way to kill the mood." "I'm serious. There are stories about this area. The Ute tribe considered it cursed long before white settlers arrived. They called it the place where hunger walks." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Great. Ghost stories. What's next? Are you going to tell us about Bigfoot?" But I noticed Jake had gone quiet, staring into the flames with an expression I'd never seen before. Ranger was pressed against his leg, trembling despite the warmth of the fire. "Jake, you okay, man?" He blinked, seeming to come back to himself. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. Long day." We banked the fire and retreated to our tents around 11. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and I drifted off to the sound of the stream and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere up in the canyon walls. I woke to absolute silence. The sudden absence of sound was so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. No stream, no wind, no insects. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around me. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Then I heard it, a wet, sliding sound like something large being dragged across stone. It came from the direction of the stream, slow and deliberate. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I lay motionless in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. Something was definitely moving around our camp. I reached for the flashlight beside my pillow, my hand shaking slightly. The beam cut through the darkness of my tent, illuminating the orange nylon walls. I could see my breath now. When had it gotten so cold? Michael. The voice was barely a whisper, but it came from right outside my tent. Michael, are you awake? It was Jake's voice, but something was wrong with it. The tone was flat, emotionless, like a recording being played at the wrong speed. Jake, what's wrong? Where's Ranger? No answer. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see the other tents. Jake's tent was directly across from mine, but it was empty, the flap hanging open like a mouth. Jake? I whispered, louder this time. A hand fell on my shoulder from behind. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly, and found myself face to face with Jake. But the Jake I was looking at wasn't the friend I'd known for over a decade. His skin was gray and waxy in the flashlight beam, his eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. His lips were pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. I found something, he said in that strange, flat voice. Down by the water. You should come see. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but this was Jake, my best friend. Maybe he was sick, hypothermic, confused. People did strange things when their core temperature dropped. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Let me get my boots on. I fumbled for my hiking boots, never taking my eyes off Jake. He stood perfectly still, watching me with that unnatural smile, not blinking. Not once. Where's Ranger? I asked again as I laced up my boots. He found it first, Jake said. The hungry place Derek mentioned. It's beautiful, Michael. You'll understand once you see it. We walked toward the stream, my flashlight beam creating a small circle of visibility in the oppressive darkness. The temperature seemed to drop with every step, and my breath came out in thick, white puffs. Jake walked slightly ahead of me, moving with an odd gliding gait that made no sound on the rocky ground. The stream had stopped flowing. What had been a rushing creek just hours earlier was now a series of stagnant pools reflecting my flashlight beam like black mirrors. And the smell. God, the smell. It was the scent of spoiled meat and wet earth, of things that had been buried too long in dark places. There, Jake said, pointing to a cluster of boulders near what used to be the water's edge. Do you see it? I directed my flashlight where he was pointing and immediately wished I hadn't. Ranger lay sprawled across the rocks, his body twisted in ways that defied anatomy. His ribcage had been torn open from the inside, and his organs were arranged in a careful pattern around his corpse. A pattern that hurt to look at, that made my eyes water and my stomach lurch. But worse than the sight was the realization that Ranger's body was steaming in the cold air, the blood still bright red and wet. Whatever had done this had happened recently. Very recently. Jesus Christ, Jake, what the hell happened to him? I turned to look at my friend and found him standing less than a foot away, close enough that I could see the black veins spiderwebbing across his gray skin, close enough to smell the rotten meat on his breath. He fed the hungry place, Jake said, and his voice was changing, becoming deeper, more guttural. Now it wants more. I ran. I crashed through the darkness, flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled over rocks and roots. Behind me, I could hear something giving chase, not the sound of human footsteps, but a wet, sliding noise punctuated by clicks and snaps that might have been joints popping or bones breaking. I reached our campsite and started screaming for the others. Sarah, Derek, Tommy, wake up. Something's wrong with Jake. Sarah's tent was closest. I grabbed the zipper and yanked it open. shining my light inside. Empty. Her sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, but there was no sign of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. Derek's tent, empty. Tommy's tent, empty. All unzipped from the inside, as if they had simply gotten up and walked away in the middle of the night. The sliding sound was getting closer. I grabbed my pack from my tent and ran toward the canyon mouth, following the beam of my flashlight and praying I could remember the way back to the main trail. The narrow walls of Devil's Throat Canyon seemed to close in around me as I ran, and I could swear I heard voices echoing from the stone, familiar voices calling my name, begging me to come back, to join them in the hungry place. I reached the creek that marked the canyon entrance and splashed across without slowing down. My flashlight beam caught something pale moving in the shadows behind me, something that might have been human-shaped if humans walked on joints that bent the wrong way. The main trail was a relief, a clearly marked path that led back to civilization. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in Devil's Throat Canyon. Dawn was breaking when I finally stopped to rest, collapsing against a trail marker that indicated I was 3 miles from the nearest road. In the growing light, I could see the mouth of the canyon far behind me, a dark slash in the red rock face that seemed to pulse like a wound. I made it to the road and flagged down a park ranger, babbling about missing friends and something that used to be Jake. The ranger, a weathered woman named Carol Hendricks, listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard plenty of tall tales from exhausted hikers. But she agreed to organize a search party. We found our campsite that afternoon. The tents were still there, arranged in Derek's perfect circle, but they were rotting. The nylon had turned gray and brittle, as if they'd been sitting there for years instead of hours. The fire pit was filled with what looked like ash and bone fragments. There was no sign of my friends, no sign of Ranger. The stream was flowing normally again, clear and cold, showing no trace of the stagnant pools I'd seen in the darkness. Sometimes the wilderness plays tricks on people, Ranger Hendricks said, making notes on her clipboard. Dehydration, altitude sickness, hypothermia, they can all cause hallucinations. Are you sure your friends didn't just hike out early? But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what Jake had become. The official report listed 4 missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure or wildlife attack. The case was closed after 6 months when no bodies were found. I was treated for severe dehydration and mild hypothermia and eventually returned to my job in Denver, where I told anyone who asked that I'd been the only survivor of a tragic hiking accident. I thought that was the end of it. Then, 3 months later, I got a call from Sarah. "Michael?" Her voice was flat, emotionless, exactly like Jake's had been that night. "Michael, are you there?" I hung up immediately, but the calls kept coming. Derek called the next week. Tommy the week after that. Always the same flat tone. Always asking if I was there, if I remembered the hungry place. I changed my number. They found the new one within days. I moved to a different city. They called the first night. I tried going to the police, but what could I tell them? That my friends who'd been declared dead kept calling me? That they wanted me to come back to a canyon in Utah to feed something that lived in the dark spaces between the rocks? The calls always came at 3:17 a.m., always the same time I'd woken up that first night. And each time, the voices sounded less human, more wrong, as if whatever was wearing my friends' faces was forgetting how to imitate them properly. Last night, Jake called again. "Michael," he said in that terrible flat voice, "I found something new, something hungry. It's not just in the canyon anymore." The line went dead. This morning, I woke up to find wet, sliding tracks leading from my front door to my bedroom window. Tracks that looked like they'd been made by something large being dragged across concrete. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened in Devil's Throat Canyon. I need someone to understand that the things wearing my friends' faces aren't my friends anymore, and that whatever they fed to the hungry place is growing stronger. The calls are getting more frequent. The voices are getting clearer. And every night, the sliding sound gets a little closer to my bedroom door. If you're reading this and I've gone missing, don't look for me. Don't go to Devil's Throat Canyon. Don't trust anyone who says they know where I am or what happened to me. And if you ever get a call from Michael Williams in the middle of the night, hang up, because whatever answers won't be me. Found among the personal effects of Michael Williams, who disappeared from his Denver apartment on November 15th. Security cameras showed him leaving his building at 3:17 a.m., walking toward the parking garage. He has not been seen since. His car was found 3 days later in a long-term parking lot at Denver International Airport. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the high Uintas wilderness of Utah, near Mirror Lake, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my best friend Marcus. I should have known something was wrong the moment we passed the weathered wooden sign marking the trailhead. The paint was peeling and someone had scratched deep gouges into the wood, not carved but clawed, as if by fingernails or something worse. Marcus laughed when I pointed it out, his breath forming small clouds in the October air. "Probably just a bear, Dave. You've been watching too many horror movies again." Marcus Chen had been my friend since college, and he was the kind of guy who found the logical explanation for everything. While I saw omens in peeling paint and strange scratches, he saw weather damage and wild life. That optimistic skepticism had gotten us through a lot of adventures over the years, from rock climbing in Moab to whitewater rafting down the Colorado. This trip was supposed to be our annual disconnect from civilization weekend. No phones, no GPS, just us, our packs, and the wilderness. The trail wound upward through dense stands of aspen and pine, their golden leaves carpeting the ground in a thick, muffling layer. Every step seemed unusually quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, that familiar prickling sensation creeping up my neck, the feeling of being watched. The trees pressed in around us, their shadows growing longer and darker as the afternoon wore on. "You're jumpy today," Marcus observed, adjusting his pack straps. His black hair was already damp with sweat despite the cool temperature. "Everything okay?" I forced a laugh. "Just tired from work, I guess. Peterson's been riding my ass about the quarterly reports." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I'd been having the dreams again, the ones that started after my brother's accident 5 years ago. Dreams of vast, empty spaces where something hungry prowled just beyond the edge of sight. Dreams where the darkness itself seemed alive, pressing against my skin like cold, wet fingers. We hiked for another 2 hours, climbing steadily through switchbacks that should have offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Instead, a strange mist had rolled in, thick and unnatural, obscuring everything beyond 20 feet in any direction. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began forming more substantial clouds. "Weather's changing fast," Marcus said, consulting his compass. He frowned, tapping the glass face. "That's weird. This thing is spinning like crazy." I pulled out my own compass and watched the needle swing wildly, unable to settle on any direction. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Both of ours can't be broken. Magnetic interference, maybe? There are iron deposits in these mountains. But Marcus's voice lacked its usual confidence. As we continued climbing, the forest began to change. The underbrush grew sparser, the trees more gnarled and twisted. Many of them bore strange markings, not the territorial scratches of bears or elk, but something else. Long, parallel gouges that spiraled around the trunks, too deliberate to be random, too high to be made by any animal I knew. "Look at this," I called out, running my fingers along one of the marks. The bark had been stripped away in perfect strips, revealing pale wood underneath. "What do you think could have done this?" Marcus examined the tree, his usual skepticism wavering. I'm not sure. Maybe some kind of territorial marking? Though I've never seen anything like it." The mist continued to thicken as we climbed, and soon we could barely see 10 feet ahead. The world had been reduced to a small bubble of visibility that moved with us, everything beyond dissolving into a gray-white void. The silence was absolute now. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. "We should find a place to camp soon," Marcus said, checking his watch. "It's getting late, and this visibility isn't going to improve." We found a small clearing just off the trail, a circular space about 30 feet across, ringed by those same twisted trees with their strange markings. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and fallen leaves, but as we began to clear a space for our tent, I noticed something disturbing. The leaves directly in the center of the clearing were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, as if someone or something had deliberately placed them that way. "Marcus, look at this." He glanced over from where he was unpacking his sleeping bag. "What?" "The leaves. They're arranged in a pattern." Marcus walked over and studied the spiral formation. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he shrugged, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Wind patterns, maybe? You know how debris can get caught in eddies." We set up our tent on the edge of the clearing, neither of us wanting to disturb the strange leaf spiral. As darkness fell, the mist seemed to glow faintly with its own phosphorescent light, creating an eerie, underwater quality to our surroundings. We built a fire using dead wood from the forest floor, but the flames burned strangely, sometimes blue-green instead of orange, and occasionally seeming to flicker in response to sounds that weren't there. "This wood must have some mineral content," Marcus said, but his voice was strained. "Copper compounds can make flames burn green." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The rational explanations were getting thinner, and we both knew it. As we ate our dinner of freeze-dried beef stew and energy bars, the forest around us began to come alive with sounds. Not the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife, but something else. Distant calls that might have been human voices echoing through the mist. The calls seemed to come from different directions, circling our camp, growing closer. "Probably other campers," Marcus said, but he was gripping his metal camping spoon so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "In this weather? In this visibility?" The calls continued, growing more frequent and more distinct. They sounded almost like names being called, long, drawn-out syllables that rose and fell in an unsettling rhythm. The words were just familiar enough to be disturbing, as if someone was calling out in a language I almost but didn't quite understand. "We should respond," Marcus said suddenly, standing up. "If they're lost, they might need help." I grabbed his arm. "No, something's not right here." "Don't be paranoid, Dave. People get lost in these mountains all the time." But before he could call out, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the crackling of our fire seemed muted, as if the sound was being absorbed by the mist around us. "See?" Marcus sat back down, but I could see he was rattled. They probably found their way. We tried to make normal conversation after that, talking about work, mutual friends, anything to fill the oppressive silence. But every few minutes one of us would glance toward the edge of our circle of firelight, where the mist created a wall of gray nothing. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it felt like whatever was out there was studying us, learning about us. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus announced he was going to gather more firewood. "I'll come with you," I said immediately. "It's fine, Dave. I'm just going to grab some of those dead branches we passed about 50 yards back. I'll be back in 10 minutes. "Marcus, I really think we should stick together." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're being paranoid. Nothing's going to happen in 10 minutes. I watched him disappear into the mist, his flashlight beam creating a moving cone of pale light that quickly faded to nothing. I fed more wood to the fire and tried to calm my nerves, telling myself that Marcus was right. I was being paranoid. But as the minutes ticked by, the cold knot in my stomach grew larger. 10 minutes passed. then 15, then 20. "Marcus," I called out, cupping my hands around my mouth. "Marcus, where are you?" No response. The mist seemed to swallow my voice almost before it left my mouth. I grabbed my flashlight and headed in the direction he'd gone, following the faint impressions of his boots in the soft earth. The trail was easy to follow at first, but after about 30 yards, it simply stopped. There were no more tracks, no disturbance in the leaves or undergrowth. It was as if Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. "Marcus!" I shouted again, louder this time. "This isn't funny?" Still nothing. I spent the next hour searching in ever-widening circles around our camp, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically small against the wall of mist that surrounded me, illuminating only a few feet in any direction. Several times I was sure I heard footsteps nearby, but when I turned toward the sound, there was nothing there. Finally, exhausted and fighting down the edge of panic, I returned to our camp. The fire had burned low, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it had gone out completely. But a few puffs of air on the coals brought the flames back to life, pushing away the encroaching darkness. I sat by the fire, jumping at every sound, real or imagined. The logical part of my mind insisted that Marcus had simply gotten lost in the mist, that he would find his way back or hole up somewhere safe until morning. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong here, that whatever had taken Marcus was still out there, watching, waiting. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. My heart leaped with relief. "Marcus! Jesus, you scared the hell out of me. Where have you been?" The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the firelight. I could see a vague human shape in the mist, but something about it seemed wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long. "Marcus!" I called again, my voice weaker now. The shape moved closer, stepping fully into the circle of light, and I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was Marcus, but it wasn't. The thing standing at the edge of our camp had Marcus's face, his clothes, his general build, but the eyes were completely black, reflecting the firelight like an animal's. His skin had a grayish pallor, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had become pointed, filed to sharp triangles. "Hello, Dave," the thing said in Marcus's voice, but the words came out wrong, too slow, with spaces between each syllable as if it was still learning how to use a human mouth. I scrambled backward, knocking over my water bottle. What are you?" "I am Marcus," it said, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "Your friend." "No, you're not." I was gripping a burning stick from the fire now, holding it between us like a weapon. "Where is he? What did you do with him?" The thing that looked like Marcus took another step closer, and I could smell it now, the stench of decay and corruption, of meat left too long in the sun. When it moved, I caught glimpses of something else beneath the familiar exterior, shadows and angles that didn't match human anatomy. "Marcus is here," it said, gesturing to itself with movements that were too fluid, too boneless. "Marcus is with us now. He is us, part of us. Stay back." I brandished the burning stick, and the creature actually recoiled slightly. "I mean it." It laughed then, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "You cannot hurt us with fire. Fire is nothing to us." But it didn't come closer, and I realized it was lying. Fire did hurt it, or at least the light did. I grabbed another stick from the fire, holding one in each hand. "What are you?" I demanded again. "We are old," it said, its black eyes never leaving mine. "Older than your people, older than your trees. We have been hungry for so long." The creature began to circle our campsite, always staying just at the edge of the firelight. As it moved, its form seemed to shift and change, sometimes looking exactly like Marcus, other times revealing glimpses of something else entirely. Something with too many joints in its limbs, with fingers that ended in claws, with a mouth that opened far too wide. "We watched you climb today," it continued in that horrible parody of Marcus's voice. "Watched you make camp. Watched you sleep. Your friend was easy to take, so trusting, so naive. Marcus fought you," I said, though I wasn't sure why I believed that. "Yes," the creature hissed, and for a moment its face changed completely, becoming something skeletal and terrible before snapping back to Marcus's features. "He fought. They all fight, but in the end, they join us. They become us." I backed toward our tent, keeping the burning sticks between myself and the creature. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. People didn't just turn into monsters. There had to be a rational explanation. But as I watched the thing wearing my friend's face, I knew there was no rational explanation for this. Some things existed beyond the boundaries of logic and reason, in the dark spaces between what we knew and what we feared. "You cannot run," the creature said, seeming to read my thoughts. "There is nowhere to go. The mist will hide us. The forest will protect us. And when you tire, when your fire burns low, we will be waiting." It was right, and we both knew it. I was lost in an endless maze of mist and twisted trees, with no idea which direction led back to civilization. My supplies were limited, and the creature, whatever it was, had infinite patience. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I grabbed my pack and began stuffing essential items into it: water, energy bars, my knife, a spare flashlight. The creature watched me with those horrible black eyes, making no move to stop me. It was confident in its advantage. "Running will only delay the inevitable," it said. "But perhaps that is what you wish. Perhaps you enjoy the fear, the anticipation." I ignored it, focusing on my pack. As I worked, I tried to remember everything I'd ever read about monsters and legends. Fire seemed to hold it back, at least partially. Light was clearly important, and it had called itself old. Older than trees, older than people. That suggested something primal, something that had existed here long before humans arrived. Wendigo. The word came to me suddenly, a fragment from some half-remembered documentary, a cannibalistic creature from Native American folklore associated with winter and famine and endless hunger. Something that could take human form but was fundamentally inhuman beneath. "You know what we are," the creature said, apparently seeing the recognition in my face. "Good. Knowledge makes the fear sweeter." I stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulders. "Maybe. But knowledge can also make you dangerous." The creature laughed again, that terrible rustling sound. "You think you can hurt us? You think your little fire will save you?" Instead of answering, I kicked dirt over our campfire. The flames died instantly, plunging us into absolute darkness. The creature shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, and I heard it thrashing around the campsite. In the same instant, I flicked on my flashlight and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, following no path except away. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing, its inhuman shrieks echoing through the mist. But I had gained a crucial few seconds of advantage while it was disoriented by the sudden darkness. The forest was a nightmare maze in the pitch black. Trees loomed out of the mist like grasping hands, and more than once I ran straight into a low branch or fallen log. But I kept moving, driven by pure terror and the certain knowledge that stopping meant death, or worse, becoming like the thing that had once been Marcus. As I ran, I began to notice something strange. The trees around me were changing, becoming more twisted and unnatural with each step. Their bark was pale and smooth, almost bone-like, and they gave off a faint phosphorescent glow that was somehow more disturbing than the absolute darkness would have been. The mist itself seemed thicker here, more viscous, clinging to my skin like cobwebs. I was running deeper into its territory, I realized, moving away from the normal forest and into some liminal space where the creature held dominion. But I couldn't stop. I could still hear it behind me, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. My flashlight beam revealed more of those spiral patterns carved into trees, and occasionally I caught sight of other things hanging from the branches, objects that might have been clothes or packs or worse. The remains of other hikers who had stumbled into this nightmare and never found their way out. After what felt like hours of running, I stumbled into another clearing, this one much larger than our campsite. The pale trees formed a perfect circle around an open space, and in the center stood a structure that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a rough shelter made from branches and bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. Skulls leered from the support posts, and strips of what looked like jerky hung from the crossbeams. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and something else, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach heave. This was its lair, the place where it brought its victims to feed. And sitting beside the bone structure, gnawing on something I didn't want to identify, was another figure that I recognized with a shock of horror and grief. Marcus. The real Marcus, or what was left of him. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face gaunt with hunger and terror, but his eyes were still human, still aware, and when he saw me, they filled with a desperate hope. "Dave," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh God, Dave, you have to get out of here. I'm not... Marcus!" I started toward him, but he held up a hand to stop me. "No. Don't come closer. I can feel it, inside me, fighting to get out. It's trying to change me, make me like it. I don't know how much longer I can hold it off." That's when I understood the full horror of the situation. The creature I'd encountered at our campsite hadn't been Marcus transformed. It had been the Wendigo itself, wearing his appearance like a mask. The real Marcus was here, still alive but infected with whatever curse or parasite allowed the creature to replicate human form. "We have to get you out of here," I said. But, even as I spoke, I could see the truth in his eyes. "I can't leave, Dave. Every step I take away from this place, it gets stronger. And when it takes over completely..." He gestured toward the bone structure with its grisly decorations. "I'll become something that hunts people like us." Behind me, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. The Wendigo had finally caught up. "Well," it said in that horrible parody of Marcus's voice, stepping into the clearing. "How touching. A reunion." In the phosphorescent glow of the bone trees, I could see it more clearly now. The creature was tall and emaciated, with skin that looked like old leather stretched over two sharp bones. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in fingers tipped with black claws. But most horrible of all was its face, a constantly shifting thing that cycled through human features like a slideshow of its victims. I saw Marcus's face, then others I didn't recognize, all of them perfect except for those terrible black eyes. "You led him right to us," it said to Marcus, whose face contorted with anguish. "Such a good friend." "Fight it, Marcus," I said, backing toward the edge of the clearing. "I know you're stronger than this thing." The real Marcus looked up at me with eyes full of pain and desperate love. "I'm trying, Dave, but it's so hungry, and I'm so tired of fighting." The Wendigo laughed, advancing on us both. "He will join us, soon. And then, you will too. We will wear your faces, visit your families, spread our hunger." That's when I made my decision. I pulled the hunting knife from my pack and held it out toward Marcus. "You know what you have to do." He stared at the knife for a long moment, then at me. "I can't ask you to..." "You're not asking, I'm offering." The Wendigo shrieked in rage, realizing what we were planning. It lunged toward us, but Marcus was faster. Even weakened and infected, he was still the athlete who had climbed mountains with me, and he reached the knife first. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. Marcus turned the blade on himself, but not before the Wendigo's claws raked across my chest, sending me sprawling. As my friend's blood soaked into the pale earth of the clearing, the creature let out a wail of loss and fury that seemed to shake the very bones of the forest. "You have cost us much," it snarled, turning those black eyes toward me. "But we are eternal. We will find others." I expected it to kill me then, but instead it began to change. The stolen faces cycling across its features moved faster now, becoming a blur of human expressions. It was losing cohesion, I realized. Marcus's death had somehow weakened it, broken its hold on this place. "Go," Marcus whispered with his last breath. "Follow the stream. East. Don't look back." I ran again, this time following the sound of water that I hadn't noticed before. A small stream that cut through the clearing and disappeared into the regular forest beyond. Behind me, the Wendigo's shrieks grew fainter and more distorted until they faded entirely. The mist began to thin as I followed the stream, and gradually the phosphorescent bone trees gave way to normal pines and aspens. My compass started working again. The silence broke as natural forest sounds returned. Owls hooting, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through normal leaves. I walked through the night and into the dawn, following the stream until it joined a larger creek that I recognized from our hiking maps. From there, I was able to find my way back to the trailhead in my car. The ranger station reported Marcus as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness. Search and rescue teams combed the area for days but found no trace of him or our campsite. The official report listed him as a victim of exposure and misadventure. I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? Even now, 3 months later, I sometimes wonder if it was all just a stress-induced hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion and the trauma of losing my best friend. But then, I remember the sound of the Wendigo's voice, the sight of those shifting faces, the smell of the bone structure in that terrible clearing, and I remember Marcus's courage in those final moments, choosing death over becoming a monster. I've moved away from Utah, taken a job in a different state where the mountains are gentler and the forests less wild. I don't camp anymore, don't even like being outside after dark. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear something calling my name from the darkness beyond my windows. But I'm alive and human, and Marcus died making sure it stayed that way. The Wendigo is still out there, somewhere in the high Uintas, waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into its territory. Maybe it's weaker now, maybe it's found a way to rebuild its strength. I don't know, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that some places should be left alone, some hungers should never be fed, and some friends are worth dying for. I just hope that when my time comes, and I have a feeling it will sooner or later, I'll have half the courage Marcus showed in that clearing of bone trees. Because in the end, courage is all we have against the hungry dark. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the high Uintas wilderness of northeastern Utah, where the ancient peaks scrape against a sky that feels too close, and the silence between the trees carries whispers of things that should have stayed buried. The trip was supposed to be a celebration. After months of grinding through our software development jobs in Salt Lake City, my 3 closest friends and I had finally finished our startup's first major project. Sarah Rodriguez, our brilliant UX designer with her infectious laugh and tendency to hum while hiking, had suggested we celebrate somewhere completely off the grid. Kevin King, our methodical project manager who approached everything like a military operation, had mapped out a 5-day backpacking route through the remote Mirror Lake Highway area. And then there was Jessica Davis, our fearless lead developer, who could debug the most complex code, but somehow always managed to get us lost on the simplest trails. We should have listened to the warnings. The old Ute ranger at the comma station had fixed us with eyes like flint when Kevin spread our topographical maps across the counter. His weathered fingers traced our planned route through the Naturalist Basin, pausing at the red X Kevin had marked as our final campsite near Packard Lake. "That area's been problematic," the ranger had said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. "Had some incidents up there, folks going missing, wildlife acting strange." His gaze lingered on each of us. "You sure you want to head that deep in? Especially this time of year?" Kevin, ever the pragmatist, had dismissed the warning with a wave. "We're experienced hikers. We've got GPS, satellite communicators, the works." He'd tapped his phone with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced true wilderness. "Technology, right?" The ranger's laugh had been dry as autumn leaves. "Technology don't mean much when the mountains decide they don't want you there." But we were young, successful, and stupidly confident. We'd loaded our packs with the latest gear, checked and double-checked our supplies, and set out on what should have been a perfect October morning. The aspens were turning, painting the mountainsides in brilliant golds and reds that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and that particular smell of snow that's still weeks away but already whispering promises. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We'd hiked 12 miles through the Provo River drainage, past cascading waterfalls and granite peaks that jutted into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sarah had stopped every few hundred yards to photograph wildflowers and mountain vistas, her camera clicking constantly as she tried to capture what she called the cathedral feeling of the wilderness. "God, I needed this," Jessica had said as we set up camp that first night beside a small alpine lake. The water was so clear we could see trout moving like shadows 20 feet down. No emails, no deadlines, no client meetings, just quiet. The quiet. That should have been our first warning. Even Kevin, who'd been tracking our progress obsessively on his GPS unit, seemed to relax as we shared freeze-dried beef stroganoff around our camp stove. The fire regulations were too strict for an open flame, but the artificial light felt somehow wrong anyway, too harsh against the gathering darkness. "Look at those stars," Sarah had whispered, lying back on her sleeping pad. Above us, the Milky Way spread across the sky like a spilled flour, more stars than any of us had ever seen. The absence of light pollution made the night feel alive, pressing down on us with a weight that was both beautiful and unsettling. That's when we first heard it. A sound that wasn't quite howling, wasn't quite screaming, but something caught between the two. It echoed off the granite walls around us, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Coyote," Kevin had said quickly, but his voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite hide. "Just coyotes." Jessica had pulled her sleeping bag up to her chin. "That didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard." The sound came again, closer this time, and we all felt it in our bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something primal and terrified deep in our reptilian brains. Sarah's camera, which she'd been using to photograph the starfield, suddenly died. The LCD screen flickered once and went black. "Weird," she'd muttered, checking the battery indicator. It was at 80% a minute ago. My phone, which I'd been using as a backup light, showed 3 bars of signal 1 second and then nothing. Not even the emergency network that was supposed to be always available. Kevin's GPS unit started showing our location as a blank space, as if we'd somehow stepped off the edge of the mapped world. "Equipment failure," Kevin had said, but he was checking and rechecking his devices with increasing urgency. Altitude, maybe. Cold affects batteries. But it wasn't cold. The October night was crisp but nowhere near freezing, and our gear was all rated for much worse conditions. Something else was draining our electronics, pulling the life out of them with invisible fingers. The second day was when things started to feel wrong. We'd broken camp early, hiking deeper into the wilderness toward Naturalist Basin. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, but somehow Kevin kept making wrong turns. He'd check his compass, frown, check it again, then lead us down paths that seemed right but somehow felt off, as if the landscape itself was subtly shifting when we weren't looking. "I don't understand this," he muttered, stopping for the fourth time to consult his map. This should be the main trail, but he pointed ahead to where the path split into 3 directions, none of which appeared on our topographical survey. "These routes aren't on any map." Sarah had been unusually quiet all morning, jumping at every small sound. A twig snapping, a bird call, the rustle of wind through the trees. Her usual humming was replaced by an anxious silence that seemed to infect all of us. "Maybe we should turn back," she'd suggested as we stood at the mysterious trail junction. "This doesn't feel right." But Jessica, always the problem solver, had studied the 3 paths with her analytical mind. "The middle one heads in the right general direction," she'd said, pointing to a trail that looked newer than the others, as if it had been carved recently by something. "We can course correct once we get to higher ground." Kevin had agreed, and I'd gone along because the alternative was admitting we were lost, which felt impossible with all our modern navigation tools. So we took the middle path, following it deeper into a part of the wilderness that felt increasingly isolated from the world we knew. The trees began to change as we climbed. The aspens gave way to ancient pines that seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too thick, their bark scarred with marks that looked almost like claw scratches but were too large and too deep to have been made by any animal I could identify. The undergrowth grew thicker and more tangled, and the air took on a musty smell, like something had been rotting just out of sight. By afternoon, we reached what Kevin insisted was Packard Lake, though it looked nothing like the photos we'd seen online. The water was black as ink, so dark that our flashlight beams seemed to disappear into it without illuminating anything below the surface. Dead trees jutted from the water like skeletal fingers, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at for too long. "This can't be right," Sarah had whispered, but we were all exhausted, and the sun was already disappearing behind the peaks around us. The temperature was dropping fast, and we needed to make camp before full darkness fell. We set up our tents in a rough circle on a flat area about 50 yards from the water's edge. The ground was soft. Too soft, as if it had been recently disturbed, and covered with a thick layer of pine needles that seemed to muffle every sound. Even our voices seemed smaller here, swallowed by the pressing silence of the forest. That's when we noticed the smell. It started as we were setting up Jessica's tent. A sweet, cloying odor like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic and wrong. Sarah wrinkled her nose first, then Jessica, then Kevin and I almost simultaneously. "What is that?" Kevin asked, looking around the campsite. "Smells like something died." We searched the immediate area but found nothing obvious. No dead animals. No obvious source of the stench. But as the darkness grew deeper, the smell seemed to intensify, carried on a wind that barely stirred the trees but somehow found its way into our nostrils and down our throats like a living thing. Dinner was a quiet affair. Our camp stove worked, but the flame burned with a strange blue-green tinge that none of us commented on but all of us noticed. The freeze-dried meals tasted like ash, and none of us could manage more than a few bites before giving up. "I'm going to gather some firewood," Jessica had announced as we sat in the growing darkness. "I know we're not supposed to have open fires, but screw the regulations. I need some real light." "I'll come with you," I'd offered, but she'd waved me off. "I'll just check the edge of the tree line. 5 minutes, tops." She'd grabbed her headlamp and disappeared into the forest before any of us could argue. That was at 7:30 p.m. I know because Kevin had checked his watch obsessively, the digital display one of the few pieces of electronics that still seemed to be working properly. At 8:00, we started calling her name. Our voices seemed to die just a few feet from our mouths, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the trees. At 8:30, We organized a search pattern, spreading out with our headlamps to comb the forest around our camp. The beams of light seemed weaker than they should have been, barely penetrating the darkness between the trees. At 9:15, Kevin found her headlamp. It was hanging from a branch about 30 feet into the forest, swaying gently in a breeze that none of us could feel. The light was still on, but the beam was pointing straight down at a patch of ground that had been churned up as if something had struggled there. "Jessica!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Jessica!" But the forest swallowed her cries, giving back only that oppressive silence and the sweet, sick smell that seemed to be growing stronger. We searched until our own lights began to fail, the batteries draining impossibly fast in the cold mountain air. By 11 p.m., we were stumbling around in near-total darkness, calling Jessica's name until our voices were raw. "We have to go back to camp," Kevin finally said, his pragmatic nature warring with his obvious terror. "We need to conserve our lights, get some rest, start fresh in the morning." None of us slept that night. We huddled together in Sarah's tent, the largest of the three, listening to sounds that had no business existing in any natural forest. Footsteps that came too close and then retreated. Breathing that seemed to circle our tent for hours. And underneath it all, a sound like chewing. Wet, methodical chewing that went on until dawn. The sun rose gray and weak, filtered through a mist that hadn't been there the night before. We emerged from the tent like zombies, exhausted and paranoid, jumping at every small sound. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the forest edge. Jessica was standing between two pine trees about 20 yards from our camp. She was perfectly still, her back to us, wearing the same clothes she'd had on the night before. Her posture was wrong somehow, too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin positioned by someone who had never quite figured out how humans naturally stood. "Jess!" Kevin called out, relief flooding his voice. "Jesus, where have you been? We've been looking for you all night." Jessica didn't respond. She didn't move at all, not even to acknowledge that she'd heard us. "Jess?" Sarah's voice was smaller now, uncertain. I started walking toward her, my boots crunching on the pine needles. As I got closer, I could see that her hair was matted with something dark and sticky, and her clothes were torn in several places. But she was standing. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Jessica, are you okay?" I called out when I was about 10 feet away. That's when she turned around. Her face was still Jessica's face, but everything else was wrong. Her skin had a gray pallor, like old meat, and her eyes. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the irises. The entire eye, from corner to corner, was the deep black of a starless night. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth had been filed to points, and something dark and viscous dripped from between her lips. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was Jessica's voice, but layered with something else, something that sounded like static or wind through dead leaves. "I'm better than fine. I'm hungry." I stumbled backward, my rational mind trying to process what I was seeing while every instinct I had screamed at me to run. This thing that looked like Jessica took a step forward, and I noticed that she wasn't quite touching the ground. Her feet hovered about an inch above the pine needles, leaving no tracks. "Where's Jessica?" I managed to croak. "What did you do with her?" The thing tilted its head to one side, much farther than any human neck should bend. "I am Jessica," it said in that horrible layered voice. "I'm just improved, enhanced, hungrier." Behind me, I could hear Sarah sobbing and Kevin cursing in a low, steady stream. The thing that wore Jessica's face looked past me at them, and its black eyes seemed to glitter with anticipation. "Don't you want to be improved too?" it asked, taking another floating step forward. "Don't you want to know what it feels like to never be hungry again? To taste everything? To consume everything?" I turned and ran. The next few minutes were pure chaos. Kevin was shouting something about Wendigos and Native American legends while frantically stuffing gear into his backpack. Sarah was curled in a ball by her tent, hyperventilating. And behind us, the thing that had been Jessica was laughing, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying animals. "We have to get out of here," Kevin was saying over and over. "We have to get out of here now." But as we grabbed our essential gear and started toward what we hoped was the trail back to civilization, we discovered that the forest had changed overnight. The paths we'd taken to reach the lake were gone, replaced by tangles of undergrowth that seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. Every direction we tried led us in circles, back to the Black Lake and the thing that had once been our friend. "It's hurting us," Sarah whispered as we found ourselves back at the campsite for the third time. "It's keeping us here." The Jessica thing was sitting on a fallen log by the water's edge, watching us with those black eyes. It had stopped pretending to be fully human. Its limbs were too long now, its joints bending in directions that made my stomach turn. But the worst part was that some part of it still looked like our friend, enough that my brain kept trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be impossible. "You can't leave," it said in its layered voice. "This is where you belong now. This is where you'll feed the hunger. This is where you'll learn that being human is just the appetizer." As the day wore on, we tried everything we could think of. We attempted to make signals with our mirrors, hoping to attract the attention of any aircraft that might be conducting search and rescue operations. We tried following the lakeshore in both directions, looking for another way out. We even attempted to build a raft from fallen logs, thinking we could cross the water to reach what looked like a trail on the opposite shore, but every effort was frustrated. Our mirrors reflected nothing but darkness, even in direct sunlight. The lakeshore seemed to extend infinitely in both directions, no matter how far we walked. And when Kevin tested the raft by stepping onto it, the logs immediately sank into the black water as if they were made of stone. Meanwhile, the Jessica thing followed us at a distance, always watching, always smiling its terrible pointed smile. Sometimes it would call out to us in Jessica's voice, saying things like, "Come on, guys, this isn't funny anymore," or "I'm scared. Please help me." But the black eyes never changed, and the wrongness in its posture never corrected itself. As the second night approached, our situation became desperate. We were down to less than a day's worth of food, our water was running low, and none of our electronic devices were working. Worse, we could all feel something changing in ourselves, a gnawing hunger that had nothing to do with our empty stomachs and everything to do with the way the Jessica thing looked at us when it thought we weren't watching. "It's trying to change us," Kevin said as we huddled together for warmth. We'd decided not to set up the tents, staying close together in the open air where we could see threats coming. "Whatever happened to Jessica, it wants to happen to us too." Sarah had been staring at the water for hours, her eyes reflecting its black surface. "Maybe it wouldn't be so bad," she whispered. "Maybe being hungry all the time would be better than being scared all the time." That's when I knew we were running out of time. The attack came just before dawn on the third day. I was on watch, trying to keep my eyes open despite the exhaustion that felt like lead in my bones, when I saw the Jessica thing standing up from where it had been sitting by the water. But now it wasn't alone. There were others with it. Tall, emaciated figures that moved like broken marionettes, their limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. They had been human once. I could see the remains of hiking gear on some of them, the tatters of outdoor clothing that had once been expensive and well-made. But now they were something else, something hungry and wrong and utterly alien. "Guys," I whispered, shaking Kevin and Sarah awake, "we've got company." The Wendigos, because that's what they were, I knew it with the certainty of prey recognizing predator, approached our makeshift camp in a loose semicircle. The Jessica thing led them, its black eyes fixed on us with unmistakable hunger. "Join us," it said in its layered voice. "Stop fighting the hunger. Stop pretending that human flesh doesn't smell delicious. Stop pretending that you don't want to taste what we've tasted." And God help me, part of me wanted to give in. The rational part of my mind recognized that we were trapped, that escape was impossible, that fighting would only prolong our suffering. But then I looked at Sarah and Kevin. Really looked at them and saw that they were still human, still worth fighting for. "Run," I whispered. "On 3. Scatter. Run." We broke in different directions, crashing through the undergrowth like panicked deer. Behind us, the Wendigos howled with voices like winter wind, and I could hear them giving chase. But for the first time since we'd entered this cursed place, the forest seemed to let us pass. Branches that had blocked our way before now bent aside, and paths that had been invisible suddenly opened before us. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress like taffy, and my legs moved without conscious direction. But eventually, impossibly, I found myself on a familiar trail. The main path we'd taken on our first day, leading back toward the ranger station and civilization. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot where we'd left Kevin's SUV. The keys were still hidden under the rear bumper where he'd left them, and I drove out of the mountains like the devil himself was behind me. The search and rescue teams found me 3 days later, dehydrated and incoherent, trying to convince anyone who would listen that my friends were still up there, changed into something terrible and hungry. They mounted a massive search operation, using helicopters and search dogs and volunteers from 3 counties. They never found Sarah or Kevin. They never found Jessica. They never even found the Black Lake. The official report stated that I had suffered a psychotic break brought on by altitude sickness and dehydration. The maps I drew of our route, the GPS coordinates I provided, the photographs Sarah had taken, none of it matched any known geography in the high Uintas wilderness. According to every expert they consulted, the place I described simply didn't exist. But I know it does, and I know that my friends are still there, changed into something that was once human but is now something much, much worse. On cold nights, when the wind howls through the canyons of Salt Lake City, I sometimes think I can hear them calling my name in voices that layer over each other like static. The hunger follows me everywhere now. Not the physical hunger that the Wendigos feel. I'm still human, still unchanged. But the hunger to go back, to find that place again, to see what my friends have become, to discover whether the Jessica thing was right about humanity being just the appetizer. I've been back to the ranger station 4 times in the past 6 months. The old Ute ranger retired the week after our trip, and the new ranger, a young woman fresh out of college, has no idea what I'm talking about when I describe the warnings we received. She's helpful and concerned and completely useless. But sometimes, when I'm studying topographical maps late at night, I think I can see it. A shadow on the paper that wasn't there before, a space between the marked trails that seems to pulse with its own dark geography. The place that exists between the official maps, where the Wendigos wait for the next group of hikers to lose their way. The hunger is patient. The hunger is eternal. And the hunger is always, always waiting for someone foolish enough to follow the wrong trail into the spaces that civilization pretends don't exist. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. I survived something that the experts say never happened, in a place that officially doesn't exist. But I dream about going back, every single night. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah, near the Mirror Lake Highway, where the aspen groves give way to endless corridors of lodgepole pine, and the silence can drive a man to madness. David Jones had been my closest friend since college, and when he suggested we escape the suffocating routine of our corporate jobs for a week-long backpacking trip, I jumped at the chance. We'd both been drowning in spreadsheets and conference calls, our souls slowly withering under fluorescent lights. The wilderness called to us like a siren song, promising clean air, clear thoughts, and the kind of peace that only comes from being completely disconnected from civilization. We drove up Highway 150 on a crisp October morning, the aspen leaves painting the mountainsides in brilliant gold that hurt to look at directly. Our destination was a remote area near Bald Mountain Pass. far from the popular camping spots that drew weekend warriors from Salt Lake City. David had found the location on an old topographic map, a hidden valley accessible only by an abandoned logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. "Look at this place," David said as we bounced along the rutted dirt track, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of his pickup truck. "Middle of nowhere. No cell towers, no tourists, no nothing. Just us and nature, the way it's supposed to be." I studied the map spread across my lap, noting how the contour lines bunched together like worried brows around steep ravines and rocky outcroppings. The area we were heading to had an ominous name, Devil's Throat Canyon, marked with sparse details on the decades-old survey. "When was the last time anyone was out here, you think?" "Does it matter?" David grinned, his blue eyes bright with anticipation. "That's the point. We're going to be the first people to set foot in this valley in years, maybe decades." The truck lurched to a stop at the end of the logging road, where a wall of fallen timber blocked any further vehicle access. We shouldered our packs, mine loaded with enough food and gear for a week, David's considerably lighter since he preferred to live off the land when possible. The October air bit at our faces as we hiked deeper into the wilderness, following what might have once been a game trail through dense undergrowth. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 hours into our hike. We'd been following a creek bed down into the valley when my GPS unit suddenly died. Not the battery. The screen went completely black and wouldn't respond to any button presses, even though I'd charged it fully the night before. "Technology," David laughed when I showed him the dead device. "This is why I stick to map and compass. Electronics always fail you when you need them most." But when David pulled out his own compass, the needle spun wildly before pointing in a direction that made no geographical sense. We stood there watching the needle dance like a drunken ballerina, both of us trying to laugh off the creeping unease that settled in our stomachs like spoiled food. "Must be some kind of mineral deposit," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the thin mountain air. "Iron ore, or something that's messing with the magnetic field." David nodded, but I caught him glancing over his shoulder as we continued deeper into the valley. The trail, if it had ever been a trail, disappeared entirely as we descended into a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by our footsteps and labored breathing. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the branches. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the very air absorbed sound. We made camp in a small clearing beside the creek, setting up our tents as the sun disappeared behind the western ridge. The temperature dropped fast once darkness fell, and we huddled around our campfire eating freeze-dried beef stew that tasted like cardboard and disappointment. "Remember that camping trip we took in Colorado?" David asked, poking at the fire with a long stick. "When we saw that mountain lion." I nodded, though something felt off about the memory. Had there been a mountain lion? I remembered the trip, remembered the tent David had borrowed from his brother, remembered the terrible storm that had soaked us to the bone. But I couldn't recall any mountain lion. "That was one hell of a cat," David continued, his eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made my skin crawl. "Beautiful creature, all muscle and hunger." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. That's when I noticed the flames were burning an odd color, not the usual orange and yellow, but with undertones of green and blue that reminded me unpleasantly of corpse flesh. "David," I said slowly, "what color does that fire look to you?" He turned to stare at the flames, and for just a moment I could have sworn his pupils reflected the light like an animal's. "Looks normal to me, Mike. Orange. Yellow. Why?" I blinked hard and looked again. The flames were perfectly ordinary. "Nothing, just tired, I guess." We banked the fire and retreated to our respective tents, but sleep eluded me. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft gurgle of the creek. But underneath these natural sounds I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart hammering against my ribs, straining to hear. The footsteps would stop for long minutes, then resume from a different direction. Sometimes they sounded human, sometimes they didn't. When morning finally came, I stumbled out of my tent exhausted and jumpy. David was already up, crouched beside the dead fire with his back to me. He didn't move when I approached, didn't acknowledge my cheerful "good morning," or respond when I asked if he'd slept well. "David?" I reached out to touch his shoulder. He spun around with inhuman speed, his face inches from mine. For just an instant, his features looked wrong, subtly distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt David's face from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. Then he blinked, and it was just David again. Normal, familiar David with his crooked nose and perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. "Sorry, man," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Didn't hear you come up. I was just thinking." "About what?" "This place." He gestured at the surrounding forest. "Don't you feel it? Like we're being watched?" I did feel it, had been feeling it since we'd arrived. The sensation of invisible eyes tracking our every movement, weighing and measuring us. But hearing David voice the feeling made it real in a way that chilled me to the bone. We broke camp after a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee that tasted like bitter mud. David suggested we explore the canyon further, following the creek to its source somewhere higher up the mountain. I agreed, eager to shake off the oppressive atmosphere of our campsite. The hike started normally enough. We picked our way along the rocky creek bed, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly beautiful pool or waterfall. David seemed more like himself as we climbed, cracking jokes and pointing out interesting rock formations. The sun climbed higher, warming our faces and lifting our spirits. But as we gained elevation, the forest around us began to change. The healthy lodgepole pines gave way to twisted, gnarled trees that looked diseased. Many were missing bark in long strips, revealing pale wood underneath that looked disturbingly like exposed bone. Strange symbols had been carved into some of the trunks, angular, primitive markings that hurt to look at directly. "Hunter signs," David said when I pointed them out. "Native Americans used to mark their territory this way." I'd never heard of such a thing, and the symbols didn't look like any Native American petroglyphs I'd seen in museums. They looked hungry, predatory, like they were reaching out from the bark to claw at my eyes. We stopped for lunch beside a small tarn whose dark water reflected nothing, not even the sky. As I unpacked sandwiches from my backpack, I noticed something disturbing. My food supplies, carefully portioned to last the entire week, were running low. We'd only been out for 2 days, but my pack contained maybe 3 days' worth of provisions at most. "David," I said slowly, "how much food do you have left?" He rummaged through his much smaller pack. Couple energy bars, some beef jerky. Why? "I'm missing food, a lot of food. Either I miscounted when I packed, or—" I trailed off, not wanting to voice the alternative. "Or what?" "Or something's been getting into our supplies." David laughed, but the sound was harsh and brittle. "What, like a bear? We hung our food properly last night. Besides, there's no sign of any animals in this whole valley. Haven't you noticed? No tracks, no scat, no nothing. It's like everything alive just left." He was right. Now that he mentioned it, the absence of wildlife was glaring. Even in the most remote wilderness areas, you'd expect to see squirrels, chipmunks, birds. Here, we were completely alone. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made my flesh crawl. We resumed hiking after lunch, but the terrain became increasingly treacherous. The creek bed narrowed into a steep-sided gorge where we had to scramble over wet rocks and fallen logs. Several times, loose stones shifted under our feet, sending us sliding toward the rushing water below. That's when David fell. We'd been navigating a particularly difficult section where the creek had carved a narrow channel through solid rock. David was ahead of me, testing each foothold carefully before committing his weight. I watched him step onto what looked like a solid ledge. The rock gave way with a wet, tearing sound, not like stone cracking, but like flesh being ripped apart. David tumbled into the creek with a splash and a cry of pain. When I reached him, he was sitting waist-deep in the icy water, cradling his left ankle. "Shit," he gasped, his face pale with pain. "I think it's broken." I helped him struggle to shore and examined the injury. His ankle was already swelling, and when I tried to rotate it gently, he nearly passed out. Definitely broken, or at least severely sprained. "We need to get you back to the truck," I said, mentally calculating the distance. "Can you walk at all?" David attempted to put weight on the injured foot and immediately collapsed. "No way. Mike, you're going to have to go for help." The prospect of leaving him alone in this place made my stomach clench with anxiety. "I don't like the idea of abandoning you here." "You're not abandoning me. You're getting help. Look, help me get set up somewhere defensible. Leave me most of the food and water and haul ass back to civilization. You can have a search and rescue team back here by tomorrow morning." It was the logical thing to do, the only thing to do. But as I helped David hobble to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock formation, every instinct I possessed screamed that I was making a terrible mistake. I left him with my sleeping bag, most of our remaining food, a water purification pump, and my emergency flare gun. The plan was simple. I'd hike back to the truck, drive to the nearest town with cell service, and call for help. The round trip would take 12 to 14 hours if I pushed hard. "I'll be back before you know it," I promised, shouldering my now much lighter pack. "I'll be here," David replied, managing a weak smile. "Not like I'm going anywhere." The hike back down the canyon passed in a blur of adrenaline and determination. I pushed myself hard, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the ache in my legs. The twisted trees seemed to lean inward as I passed, their carved symbols glowing faintly in the fading afternoon light. I reached our original campsite just as the sun was setting, and that's when I realized I'd made a critical error. In my haste to reach help, I'd left behind my headlamp. David had the other one. The forest was already deep in shadow, and full darkness was only minutes away. I had two choices: attempt to navigate the treacherous trail in complete darkness, or wait until morning. The sensible thing would be to wait. The responsible thing would be to wait. But something was wrong with this place. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton stuffed with needles. I had to get out, had to reach help before what? I didn't want to think about it. I pushed forward into the gathering darkness, using my hands to feel for the trail markers we'd noted on our way in. Progress was painfully slow, and several times I lost the path entirely, stumbling through underbrush and deadfall until I could relocate familiar landmarks. That's when I heard David calling my name. "Mike! Mike, where are you?" His voice echoed through the forest from somewhere behind me, back toward the canyon where I'd left him with a broken ankle. My blood turned to ice water. There was no way he could have followed me. No way he could be walking at all. "Mike, come back. I need help." The voice was definitely David's, but something about it was wrong. The tone, the inflection, like someone doing an imperfect impression of my friend. I stood frozen in the darkness, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it echoing off the trees. "Mike, please, there's something wrong with my leg." Against every instinct, I found myself turning back toward the canyon. David was hurt. David needed help. The voice sounded wrong because he was in pain, because he was scared and alone in the darkness. I'd taken maybe 10 steps when I heard a different sound, a wet, tearing noise like the one the rock had made when it broke under David's weight. Except this time, it sounded organic, hungry. The calling stopped. I ran, stumbled, fell, picked myself up, and ran some more. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind me, I could hear something large crashing through the underbrush, pursuing me with inhuman persistence. I don't remember reaching the truck. One moment I was fleeing through Nightmare Forest. The next, I was fumbling with the keys in the driver's side door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip them. The engine turned over on the third try, and I floored the accelerator, sending gravel spraying as I raced down the mountain. Cell service returned about 20 miles down the highway. I pulled over at a gas station and called 911 with trembling fingers, trying to explain the situation to a skeptical dispatcher. A broken ankle, I told them. Remote location. GPS coordinates that I read from our original map, praying they were accurate. The search and rescue team assembled at dawn. I led them back up the mountain in a convoy of trucks and ATVs, my stomach knotted with anxiety and guilt. What if David had died during the night? What if his injuries were more serious than we'd thought? What if I'd imagined the voice in the darkness? What if I hadn't? We reached the end of the logging road in half the time it had taken David and me to drive it originally. The SAR team was efficient and professional, their radio chatter crisp and confident as they prepared for the hike into the canyon. "How far to the victim's location?" asked the team leader, a weathered woman named Sarah who looked like she'd spent her entire life in the mountains. I consulted the map, trying to estimate distances. About 4 miles, maybe 5. He's in a gorge beside the creek, under some overhanging rocks. We moved out in single file, following the same route David and I had taken 2 days earlier. But something was different. The trail was clearer, the landmarks more obvious. We made excellent time, reaching the canyon in less than 2 hours. That's when we found David. He was sitting exactly where I'd left him, his back against the rock wall, my sleeping bag draped over his shoulders. He waved cheerfully when he saw us approaching, and my relief was so intense it made my knees weak. "Mike, thank God you made it back. I was starting to worry." The SAR team immediately went to work, checking his vitals and examining his ankle. But as I watched them work, a cold certainty settled in my chest. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. David's ankle wasn't swollen anymore. In fact, when one of the paramedics asked him to move it, he rotated it freely with no sign of pain. "Feels much better," he said with that too wide smile. "Must not have been as bad as we thought." "Sir," the paramedic said slowly, "yesterday you thought this ankle was broken." "That's right," David nodded enthusiastically. "But it's fine now. Amazing what a good night's rest can do." The paramedic exchanged glances with his partner. "Can you stand up? Walk around a bit?" David sprang to his feet with fluid grace, walking in a small circle without even the slightest limp. See? Good as new. But it wasn't David's miraculous recovery that made my blood turn to slush. It was the way he moved. Too smooth, too controlled, like a puppet being operated by someone who'd never actually seen a human walk. And his eyes. His eyes were wrong. The same brown color, the same shape, but behind them was something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "We should head back," I said quickly. "David's obviously feeling better, but we should still get that ankle looked at by a doctor." "Absolutely," David agreed, still smiling. "I'm ready to go home." The hike back to the trucks passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by the forest this time, but by David. Every time I glanced back, he was staring at me with those wrong eyes, that plastic smile never wavering. The SAR team offered to transport us back to town in one of their vehicles, but David insisted we take his truck. "Mike and I need to talk," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. His grip was too strong, his fingers too cold even through my jacket. We rode in silence for the first few miles, the only sound the growl of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. I kept stealing glances at David from the corner of my eye, looking for some sign of the friend I'd known for over a decade. "You're being very quiet," David said finally, his voice carrying that same wrong inflection I'd heard in the forest. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," I lied. "It's been a long couple of days." "Yes," he agreed, "very long, very educational." The way he said the word educational made my skin crawl. What do you mean? David turned to look at me fully, and for just an instant, his face seemed to ripple like water. I learned so much about you, Mike. About your memories, your fears, your flavor. I slammed on the brakes, sending the truck skidding to a stop on the shoulder of the highway. Get out. What? David's expression shifted to one of confused innocence. Mike, what's wrong? You're acting strange. You're not David. The words came out as a whisper, but they felt like a shout. I don't know what you are, but you're not my friend. The thing wearing David's face tilted its head at an unnatural angle. Of course I'm David. Who else would I be? Prove it, I said, my hand moving slowly toward the door handle. Tell me something only David would know. It smiled wider, showing far too many teeth. I know you wet the bed until you were 12. I know you've been in love with your brother's wife for 6 years. I know you think about killing yourself every Tuesday morning when your alarm goes off for work. My blood turned to ice. Those were David's memories, things I'd confided to him over years of friendship. But the way this thing recited them, cold, mechanical, like reading from a grocery list, proved it wasn't him. I know you taste like copper and fear, it continued, its voice dropping to a guttural whisper. I know your meat is soft and sweet and warm. I bolted from the truck, sprinting down the highway shoulder toward the distant glow of civilization. Behind me, I heard the truck door slam and footsteps on pavement, measured, unhurried steps that somehow kept pace with my panicked flight. Mike, the David thing called after me. Where are you going? We're friends, remember? Best friends. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside the highway just as a state trooper's cruiser crested the hill. The officer found me babbling about monsters and possession and things wearing human faces. They never found David's truck, or the thing driving it. The official report listed David Jones as missing, presumed dead due to exposure in the wilderness. I told them about the broken ankle, the rescue attempt, the successful evacuation by the SAR team. I didn't mention the wrongness, the too wide smiles, the ancient hunger lurking behind familiar eyes. Who would believe such a story? I moved to a different state after that. Changed my job, my phone number, my entire life. But sometimes, on quiet Tuesday mornings when my alarm goes off for work, I catch a glimpse of a familiar face in crowds. Always watching, always smiling that too wide smile. And I know that someday, when I'm least prepared for it, my old friend David will come to visit me again, to finish what was started in that cursed valley where the trees bleed and the stones scream and things that should not be wear the faces of those we love. I taste like copper and fear, you see, and it's still hungry. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Deep Creek Mountains of northwestern Utah, in a place so remote that our cell phones hadn't shown a single bar for 3 days. We were 5 friends who'd known each other since college. Me, Marcus Reed, a software engineer with an obsessive need to document everything with his camera. Sarah Rodriguez, a nurse whose calm demeanor could handle any crisis. Kevin King, a construction foreman built like a linebacker who joked his way through every uncomfortable situation. And Amanda Wright, a teacher whose hiking expertise had convinced us this trip was a good idea. What started as a celebration of Marcus finally landing his dream job had turned into something I still wake up screaming about. The Deep Creek Mountains stretch along the Utah-Nevada border, a forgotten range where the Pony Express once carried mail through terrain so harsh it broke horses and men alike. Amanda had chosen the area specifically because it was untouched by civilization. No trails, no camping permits required, no other hikers for dozens of miles. Just us and 30,000 acres of high desert wilderness where the wind carved ghost stories into the sandstone. We'd been hiking for 2 days when we found the bones. It was Sarah who spotted them first. scattered around what looked like an old campsite in a narrow canyon about 50 yards off our intended route. The bones were bleached white by the desert sun, and there were too many of them. Too many different sizes. "Could be deer," Kevin said, but his usual joking tone was absent. He poked at a femur with his hiking pole and it crumbled to dust. "Some of these are human," Sarah said quietly. She was crouched near what was unmistakably a human skull, partially buried in the red sand. "This one too." She pointed to a rib cage tangled in the roots of a dead juniper tree. Marcus was already clicking away with his camera, documenting everything with the methodical precision that made him a good programmer. There's got to be dozens of skeletons here. What could kill this many people? Amanda was studying her topographic map with increasing confusion. This area isn't marked as having any historical significance. No mining claims, no old settlements. She trailed off, her finger tracing over the map. "That's weird." "What?" "According to this, we should be 3 miles southwest of here, but I've been following my compass all day." She held up the compass, and I watched the needle spin lazily before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't north. Kevin laughed, but it came out forced. "Cheap compass. Good thing we have GPS." Except when Marcus checked his GPS unit, it showed our location as a blue dot floating in an empty white space. No topographic features, no coordinates, just void. "It's the canyon walls," Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced, interfering with the signal. That night we camped 2 miles from the bone site in a sheltered alcove that Amanda swore would protect us from the wind. But the wind found us anyway, howling through the canyon with a sound like human voices calling for help. It died down around midnight, and in the sudden silence, we heard something worse. Footsteps. Not the soft pad of wildlife, but the deliberate crunch of boots on gravel, circling our camp. Kevin grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the darkness beyond our dying fire. But the beam seemed to stop just a few feet from us, swallowed by a blackness that felt solid. "Probably a park ranger," Marcus whispered, but we all knew there were no park rangers out here. This wasn't even a park. The footsteps stopped directly behind my tent. I could hear breathing that wasn't quite right, too fast, too shallow, like someone who'd been running for miles. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze, the zipper of my tent starting to open from the outside. I hadn't moved. None of us had left our tents. I pressed my face to the nylon wall and listened to the zipper continue its slow journey downward, metal teeth separating one by one. When it reached the bottom, I heard the tent flap fold back with a soft whisper. Nothing entered. The tent remained empty except for me, but I could feel something watching from the opening, something that radiated a cold so intense it made my breath visible in the desert air. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent door, the one that should have been open, and found it securely closed. But in the sand beside my tent were footprints, human-shaped but wrong. Too long, with toe marks that extended into claws. They circled our entire camp 3 times, then led off into the maze of sandstone canyons. "Pack up," Amanda said when I showed the others. Her face was pale and she kept looking over her shoulder. "We're leaving. Now." But when we tried to retrace our steps, we found that our own footprints from the day before had vanished. Every trail we'd marked, every landmark we'd noted, gone. The canyon itself seemed different, with passages we didn't remember and rock formations that belonged in someone else's nightmare. Marcus's camera had malfunctioned overnight. Every photo he'd taken of the bone site had been corrupted, showing only static and shadows that looked almost like faces screaming in the white noise. By noon, we were officially lost. Kevin tried to make light of it. "Great job, Amanda. 5-star tour guide right here. Where to next? The Bermuda Triangle." But Amanda wasn't listening. She was staring at her map, which now showed features that definitely hadn't been there before. An entire canyon system had appeared overnight, drawn in faded pencil lines that looked decades old. "This is impossible," she muttered, comparing the map to her compass, which was now spinning wildly. "Maps don't change." That's when Sarah noticed that Kevin was bleeding. It wasn't much, just a thin line of red seeping through his shirt near his shoulder blade. But when she pulled up his shirt, we found 3 parallel cuts, each about 4 inches long, sliced clean through the fabric and into his skin. "What the hell?" Kevin twisted around trying to see the wounds. "When did this happen? I didn't feel anything." The cuts were precise, too clean for brambles or rocks. They looked deliberate, like claw marks. We bandaged Kevin up and pushed on, following what Amanda hoped was an eastern route out of the canyon system. But the sun seemed wrong, hanging in parts of the sky where it shouldn't be, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. Around 3 in the afternoon, we heard Marcus calling for help, except Marcus was standing right next to me. The voice came from deeper in the canyon, definitely Marcus's voice, screaming our names with increasing panic. But the real Marcus, the one beside me, was staring in the direction of the sound with an expression of pure terror. "That's not me," he whispered. "That's not me calling." The voice called again, closer now. "Guys, help! I'm hurt! I can't find you!" Sarah started toward the sound, but Amanda grabbed her arm. "Don't! Something's wrong." "Marcus!" Kevin called out. "Kevin! Thank God!" The voice was getting closer, but there was something off about it now. The words were right, but the tone was too eager, too hungry. "I found something. You have to see this." The real Marcus backed against the canyon wall. "I never said that. I never found anything." We waited in silence as the footsteps approached. When the thing that looked like Marcus finally appeared around a bend in the canyon, we knew immediately that it wasn't him. It was close enough to fool someone at a distance. Same height, same build, same clothes, but the proportions were subtly wrong. The arms hung too long, the fingers stretched too far, and the smile was too wide, showing too many teeth that were too sharp. The worst part was the eyes. They were Marcus's eyes, but filmed over with a white membrane that reflected the desert sun like mirrors. "Found you," it said in Marcus's voice, and started walking toward us with movements that were almost human, but not quite. Each step was too long, each joint bent at the wrong angle. Sarah screamed. The thing that wasn't Marcus tilted its head at the sound, that terrible smile growing wider. "Why are you screaming, Sarah? It's just me." Kevin stepped forward, gripping his hiking pole like a weapon. "Stay back." "Kevin," it said, and the way it spoke his name made my skin crawl. "You look hurt. Let me help you." It reached out with those 2 long fingers, and Kevin swung the hiking pole. The aluminum rod passed right through the creature like it was made of smoke, but the impact made a sound like breaking glass, and the thing stumbled backward. "Run," Amanda whispered. "Run now." We ran. The canyon had become a maze of identical passages, each one leading to another dead end or looping back on itself. Behind us, the thing that wore Marcus's face was calling our names, sometimes in Marcus's voice, sometimes in our own voices, begging us to wait, to help, to come back. The real Marcus was hyperventilating. "It had my face," he kept saying. "It had my face, but it wasn't me. How did it have my face?" We found shelter in a narrow slot canyon where the walls pressed so close together that the sky was just a thin strip of blue overhead. Amanda said we'd wait until dark, then try to find our way out using the stars. But when darkness fell, there were no stars. The sky above our narrow canyon was an empty black void, like someone had painted over the universe with tar. Our flashlights seemed dimmer, their beams barely penetrating the darkness that pressed down on us like a living thing. That's when Kevin started acting strange. It was subtle at first. He stopped talking, stopped making his usual jokes. When Sarah asked if his shoulder was still hurting, he just nodded without looking at her. When Amanda asked him to help her check the map, he stared at her for a long moment before responding. "Sure," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. Marcus noticed it too. "You okay, man?" Kevin turned toward him, and in the weak light of our flashlights I saw that his pupils were dilated so wide that his eyes looked completely black. "I'm fine," Kevin said, "just tired." But he wasn't blinking. At all. Sarah was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Kevin, when did you last remember being yourself?" He cocked his head to one side like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "What kind of question is that?" "Answer her," Amanda said, and there was authority in her voice that I'd never heard before. Kevin's smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "I've always been myself. Haven't I, Daniel?" The way he said my name made my blood freeze. It was exactly the same tone the fake Marcus had used. "You're not Kevin," Marcus said, backing away. "Of course I am." Kevin stood up, and his movements were all wrong, like he was a marionette being worked by someone who didn't quite understand how human joints functioned. "I'm Kevin King, construction foreman, born in Ogden, Utah, graduated from Weber State. Favorite color is blue." He recited the facts like he was reading from a script, his voice never changing inflection. "What's my middle name?" Sarah asked quietly. Kevin stared at her with those black, unblinking eyes. "Rodriguez. My middle name, not my last name." "Rodriguez," he repeated. Sarah started crying. "Kevin's known me for 8 years. He was at my wedding. My middle name is Elizabeth." The thing that looked like Kevin tilted its head again. "Elizabeth," it said, testing the word. "Elizabeth." It smiled wider. "Pretty name." That's when it lunged. Kevin, or the thing wearing Kevin's body, moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance between us in a single bound. Sarah screamed and threw herself backward, but those 2 long fingers caught her arm, and I heard her shoulder pop as she was yanked forward. Marcus swung his flashlight like a club, connecting with the creature's skull with a wet crack. It let go of Sarah and turned toward him, and I saw that the impact had caved in the side of its head, but there was no blood. Just a dark hollow where Kevin's temple should have been. "That hurt," it said in Kevin's voice, and the broken skull began to reshape itself, bones flowing like liquid until it looked normal again. Amanda was screaming at us to run, but the slot canyon was too narrow. We could only go forward or back, and the creature was blocking our retreat. It reached for Marcus, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at the thing's center mass. The rock passed through its chest like it was made of fog, but the creature stumbled and turned toward me. "Daniel," it said, and smiled with Kevin's face. "Want to play?" It took a step toward me, and its foot landed wrong, bending sideways at an impossible angle. The creature looked down at its own leg with confusion, then back at me. "Something's wrong," it said, and for a moment its voice was Kevin's again. Really, Kevin's. "Daniel, help me. I can't control." Its head snapped back up and the thing was back in control. "Just kidding," it said, and laughed with a sound like breaking bones. But I'd seen enough. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't fully in control of Kevin's body. It was fighting him for dominance. "Kevin," I shouted, "if you can hear me, fight it." The creature's smile faltered. There is no Kevin. There is only hunger. "Bullshit!" I stepped closer, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "Kevin, remember when you built that deck for your mom? You cut your thumb with the circular saw and bled all over the 2x4s. The creature's face went blank. "You said the wood looked better with your blood on it. Said it gave it character." Its hands began to shake. "Kevin King," I said louder. "Born July 15th, 1995. Middle name Thomas. You're afraid of spiders but won't admit it. You cry at the end of It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas." "Stop," the creature said, but its voice was uncertain now. "You broke your arm in 3rd grade when Jimmy Morrison dared you to jump off the school roof. You still have the scar." The creature grabbed its head with both hands and screamed, a sound that was part human anguish and part something else, something hungry and ancient and furious. "Kevin!" Sarah shouted. "Fight it!" For a moment, the thing's eyes cleared, and it was Kevin looking back at us. Really Kevin. Terrified and confused, but definitely him. "Run," he whispered. "I can't hold it much longer. It's so hungry, and it wants to wear all of you." Then the blackness flooded back into his eyes, and the creature smiled again. "Touching," it said, "but futile." It lunged again, but this time Amanda was ready. She'd found a sharp piece of sandstone and drove it into the creature's back. The stone passed through its body like everything else, but where it entered, Kevin's flesh began to dissolve, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. The creature screamed and spun around, backhanding Amanda across the narrow canyon. She hit the wall hard and crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from her nose. But the damage was done. Whatever was wearing Kevin's body was losing cohesion, his form flickering like a bad television signal. Through the static, I caught glimpses of what was underneath. Something tall and emaciated, with skin like bark and eyes like holes in the world. It was a Wendigo. I'd read about them in college, in a comparative folklore class I'd taken as an elective. Cannibalistic spirits from Algonquian legend, creatures of endless hunger that wore the faces of their victims. But according to the stories, Wendigos were from the Great Lakes region, not the Utah desert. What was one doing here? The creature that had been Kevin was falling apart now, its stolen body dissolving piece by piece. But it wasn't giving up. If anything, it seemed more dangerous as it lost its human disguise. "You cannot escape," it said, and its voice was no longer Kevin's but something else, something that sounded like wind through dead trees. "I have tasted you. I know your scent. I will follow you to the ends of the earth." Then it collapsed entirely, Kevin's body hitting the ground like an empty suit of clothes. For a moment, I thought we'd won. Then the real horror began. The Wendigo's true form rose from the remnants of Kevin's flesh, 8 feet tall and impossibly thin, with arms that reached nearly to the ground and fingers like broken twigs. Its skin was the color of dried blood, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at wrong angles. But the worst part was its face, or the place where its face should have been. Instead, there was just a gaping hole filled with row after row of needle-sharp teeth. It turned that terrible void toward us and spoke without moving its mouth, its voice echoing from inside its hollow skull. So much sweeter when you run. We ran. The slot canyon opened into a wider passage, but the Wendigo was faster than us, its long legs covering ground with impossible speed. Behind us, I could hear it laughing, a sound like autumn leaves burning. Marcus tripped and went down hard, skinning his palms on the rough sandstone. The Wendigo was on him in seconds, those skeletal hands reaching for his throat. I turned back without thinking, grabbing a piece of broken rock and hurling it at the creature's head. This time, the stone didn't pass through. It struck the Wendigo in what would have been its temple, and the creature shrieked and staggered backward. "Iron!" Amanda shouted from somewhere behind me. "The rock has iron in it." I looked at the stone in my hand and saw the rusty red streaks that indicated iron ore deposits, common in this part of Utah. The Wendigo was clutching its head, black blood seeping between its fingers. "Everyone grab rocks!" I yelled. "Find ones with iron." We armed ourselves with chunks of iron-bearing sandstone and backed away from the Wendigo, which was swaying on its feet but still very much alive. Its eyeless face tracked our movements, and when it spoke, its voice was filled with rage. "Clever little mortals, but iron only delays the inevitable. I have fed on your friend's essence. I know his memories, his fears. I know all of you now." It was right. Even as we threw stones at it, the Wendigo seemed to know exactly how we'd move, exactly what we'd do. It dodged most of our attacks and closed the distance between us step by step. That's when Sarah surprised everyone, including the Wendigo. Instead of throwing her rock, she charged straight at the creature, screaming like a banshee. The Wendigo, apparently not expecting such a direct assault, hesitated for just a moment. Sarah slammed her iron-bearing stone into the center of its chest, where a human heart would be. The Wendigo exploded. Not literally, but its form burst apart like smoke in a strong wind, dissipating into wisps of darkness that were carried away by the desert breeze. For a moment, the canyon was silent except for our ragged breathing. Then we heard Kevin's voice, weak but definitely human, coming from where his body had fallen. "Guys, what happened? Why do I taste copper?" We found him naked and confused, covered in cuts and bruises but alive. Really alive, with normal eyes that blinked at appropriate intervals and a pulse that Sarah confirmed was strong and steady. "I remember. Something was in my head," he said as we helped him into spare clothes from our packs. "Something hungry. It showed me things, terrible things. People it had killed and eaten. It wanted to add us to the collection." Amanda was studying her map again, which had returned to normal. Our location was clearly marked, and she could see the route back to our car. "We need to leave," she said. "Now, before it comes back." "It's dead," Marcus said. "Sarah killed it." "No," Amanda shook her head. "I've been thinking about this. Wendigos are spirits of cannibalism and starvation. They're drawn to places where people have died from hunger. Those bones we found—" She didn't need to finish. We all understood. The Wendigo had been feeding here for a long time, drawing travelers into the maze of canyons and trapping them until starvation drove them to cannibalism. Then it would possess the survivors and use them to lure in more victims. "How many people do you think it killed?" Sarah asked quietly. "Dozens," Amanda said. "Maybe hundreds. This has probably been going on for decades." We hiked through the night, following Amanda's compass and map out of the canyon system. By dawn, we reached our car, parked exactly where we'd left it 3 days earlier. The sight of that familiar blue Honda CR-V sitting in the morning sunlight was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. But as we loaded our gear into the trunk, Marcus made a discovery that chilled us all. "Look at this," he said, holding up his camera. "The photos are back." The corrupted images had somehow restored themselves, showing clear pictures of the bone site in horrifying detail. Skulls and rib cages and femurs scattered across an area the size of a football field, some still wearing the rotted remnants of clothing. But there was something else in the photos, something we hadn't noticed when we were there in person. In the background of every image, barely visible in the shadows between the rocks, were shapes that looked almost human. Dozens of them, standing perfectly still, watching us with eyes that reflected the camera flash like mirrors. "We were never alone," Sarah whispered. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Kevin slept in the passenger seat, exhausted from his ordeal. Marcus sat in the back, deleting and resaving the photos on his camera, unable to believe what they showed. Amanda drove with grim determination, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every few minutes, she'd check the rearview mirror and I could see the fear in her eyes. "You keep looking back," I said. "What are you afraid of?" "Nothing," she said quickly. Too quickly. I turned around to look through the rear window. The road behind us was empty, just asphalt and desert scrub stretching to the horizon. But there was something wrong with the heat shimmer rising from the pavement. It moved in patterns that didn't match the wind, swirling in shapes that looked almost like eyes, I said. "There are eyes in the heat shimmer." Amanda pressed harder on the accelerator. "Don't look back. Whatever you do, don't look back." But I couldn't help myself. The shapes in the shimmer were becoming clearer, more defined. Faces pressed against the air itself, dozens of them, all staring at our car with expressions of desperate hunger. "It's following us," Marcus said from the back seat. He'd stopped looking at his camera and was watching the road behind us. All of them. Everyone it ever killed. The faces in the heat shimmer were reaching toward us now, their mouths open in silent screams. And among them, I saw faces I recognized. The bones from the canyon, given form and animation by some terrible power. "How far to the main highway?" I asked. 20 miles, Amanda said through gritted teeth. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 80. The faces in the shimmer kept pace with us effortlessly, their expressions growing more desperate with each passing mile. Then, suddenly, they were gone. We'd crossed some invisible boundary and the desert behind us looked normal again. Just empty road and scrub brush and the distant outline of the Deep Creek Mountains. Iron, Amanda said, pointing to a sign by the roadside. Historic marker, overland stage route. Iron deposits in this area were crucial to early settlement. The main highway was rich with iron ore, a natural barrier that the Wendigo's influence couldn't cross. We drove to the nearest town, a tiny place called Ibapa, that consisted of a gas station, a diner, and maybe 24 houses. At the gas station, Amanda called the state police and tried to report what we'd found. They were polite but skeptical. A search and rescue team would investigate the bone site, they said, but it would take several days to organize an expedition into such remote terrain. They won't find anything, Kevin said as we sat in the diner, nursing coffee and trying to process what had happened to us. It'll just be an empty canyon. He was right. When the search team finally reached the coordinates Amanda provided, they found nothing. No bones, no evidence of any campsite, not even the canyon itself. According to their report, the area was just a flat expanse of desert with no significant geological features. But Marcus's photos remained. Clear evidence of what we'd found, what we'd survived. He uploaded them to several paranormal research websites, and within days, our story was spreading across the internet. Most people dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. The photos were obviously manipulated, they said. The story was too fantastic to believe. Just another creepypasta designed to go viral. But there were others who believed us. People who'd had their own encounters in remote places, their own brushes with things that shouldn't exist. They shared our story, added their own experiences, built a community of survivors who understood what we'd been through. That was 6 months ago. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear Kevin's voice calling my name from somewhere outside my apartment. But when I look out the window, there's nothing there except the city lights and the comforting hum of traffic. Sarah moved to New York, as far from Utah as she could get. She sends postcards occasionally, always from places with lots of people and bright lights. Staying visible, she writes on the back. Writes, staying safe. Marcus became obsessed with his photos, spending hours studying them for details he might have missed. He found things, faces in the shadows that seemed to watch the camera, symbols carved into rocks that matched no known alphabet, patterns in the bone arrangements that suggested ritual rather than random death. Amanda never hiked again. She sold all her equipment and took up urban photography instead, documenting the life and energy of cities. Wilderness is overrated, she told me once. I prefer places where things can't hide. Kevin recovered physically, but the experience changed him. He became quiet, thoughtful, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding anywhere too isolated. He moved in with his girlfriend and got a job in downtown Salt Lake City, where he could be surrounded by people and noise and the constant reassurance of civilization. As for me, I write about it. This story, others like it, accounts of people who've encountered things in the empty places of the world. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I learned long ago that people believe what they want to believe. But sometimes when I'm driving through the desert on my way to visit family in Nevada, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that don't match the objects casting them, heat shimmer that forms faces when I'm not looking directly at it. And I remember Amanda's words from that last day. Don't look back. So I don't. I keep my eyes on the road ahead, my hands steady on the wheel, and I drive a little faster than the speed limit until I'm safely back in civilization. Because I know the truth that most people refuse to accept. The wilderness isn't empty. It never was. And some things are still out there, waiting in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, hungry for travelers who venture too far from the safety of iron and cities and light. The Wendigo may be gone, but its hunger remains, passed on to other things in other empty places. And sometimes, on very quiet nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear it calling. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I survived the Deep Creek Mountains, but I'm not sure I'll ever really escape them. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Uintas Mountains, near the Ashley National Forest in northeastern Utah, where I had been living off-grid for 8 months, trying to forget what I'd done. The cabin I'd built sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, about 15 miles from the nearest dirt road and 40 from any real civilization. I'd chosen this place specifically because it was the kind of location where a man could disappear completely, where the weight of his mistakes couldn't follow him through the maze of pine and aspen that stretched endlessly in every direction. The nearest landmark was an old mining claim called Devil's Backbone Ridge, a jagged outcropping of red rock that locals said was cursed. I didn't believe in curses then. I'd been a financial analyst before everything went wrong, before the investigation, before Sarah found out what I'd been doing with the company funds, before the divorce papers and the criminal charges that somehow got dropped due to a technicality. I was innocent legally, but guilt had eaten through me like acid, and the only cure I could find was isolation. Complete, total isolation. The cabin was rough but functional, 12 feet by 16 feet, with a stone fireplace I'd built myself using rocks from the creek bed. I had solar panels for basic electricity, a water pump that drew from the stream running 30 yards from my door, and enough canned goods and supplies to last through winter. No phone service, no internet, no connection to the world that had branded me a thief and a liar. For 8 months, it had been perfect. Until the watching began. I first noticed it on a Tuesday in late October. The aspen leaves had turned brilliant gold, and the morning air carried that sharp bite that promised snow within weeks. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when I felt eyes on me. Not animal eyes. I'd grown accustomed to the deer that grazed nearby, the elk that sometimes wandered through, even the occasional black bear. This was different. Deliberate, intelligent. I straightened up, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved except the gentle sway of pine boughs in the breeze. The silence felt wrong somehow. Too complete. Even the usual chatter of squirrels and birds had stopped. I shrugged it off and went back to splitting wood, but the feeling lingered like a cold hand pressed against the back of my neck. That night, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee and a battered paperback, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps that crunched through the fallen leaves in a steady rhythm. I grabbed my shotgun and crept to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains I'd made from old blankets. The moonlight illuminated the clearing around my cabin in silver and black shadows, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued their circuit, around the back, along the side, past the front door, completing a perfect circle before starting again. I counted 17 complete circuits before the sound stopped abruptly, as if someone had simply vanished mid-step. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found the tracks, bare human footprints in the soft earth, but wrong somehow. Too long, with the toes spread unnaturally wide. The heel marks were deeper than they should have been, as if whatever made them was much heavier than a normal person. The prints formed a perfect circle around my cabin, exactly as I'd heard the night before. I followed the trail beyond the circle, hoping to find where my visitor had come from and gone. The tracks led straight into the forest, deeper than I'd ever ventured, toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. About 100 yards from the cabin, they simply disappeared. Not faded, not obscured by undergrowth, they just stopped existing, as if whatever made them had simply lifted off the ground and flown away. That was when my supplies started disappearing. It began small. A can of beans that I could have sworn was on the top shelf now missing entirely. Coffee grounds scattered across the floor despite my certainty that I'd sealed the container tight. My spare flashlight vanished from the hook beside the door, only to reappear 3 days later hanging from a tree branch 20 feet outside my window. Then my rifle disappeared. I kept it in a locked cabinet beside my bed, an old Winchester .30-06 that I'd bought for protection against bears. The lock hadn't been tampered with. The cabinet showed no signs of forced entry, but the rifle was gone. In its place was a single raven feather, black as pitch and longer than any raven feather had a right to be. I started checking my perimeter twice daily, looking for signs of intrusion. The bear footprints appeared sporadically, always in different patterns. Sometimes they formed spirals, sometimes straight lines that ended at impossible angles, as if the maker had walked straight up a tree trunk. Once, I found them on my roof, leading from one end to the other and then simply stopping at the edge. My sleep became fractured, filled with dreams of pursuit through endless corridors of pine trees. I would run until my lungs burned, but the footsteps behind me never grew closer or farther away, maintaining that same steady rhythm I'd heard outside my cabin. I'd wake, gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, and lie listening for sounds that never came. 2 weeks after the watching began, my fire went out. I'd bank the coals carefully before bed, as I did every night. The fireplace had been drawing well, the chimney clear, plenty of seasoned wood stacked nearby. But sometime in the night, the fire died completely. Not just reduced to coals, but stone cold, as if it had been extinguished for hours. When I tried to relight it, the matches wouldn't catch. The wood wouldn't take flame. Even when I tried using paper and kindling, everything just smoldered and died. I spent the entire next day trying to restart that fire using every technique I knew, but nothing worked. As sunset approached, I was resigned to a cold night. Then, just as full darkness fell, the fire roared to life on its own. I sat bolt upright in my chair, watching flames dance merrily in the fireplace as if they'd been burning all along. But these weren't normal flames. They burned blue-green at the edges, casting an eerie glow that made the shadows in my cabin writhe like living things. The fire gave off no heat, despite its vigorous appearance, and the wood consumed by it never diminished. I fed that unnatural fire all night, afraid of what might happen if it went out again. By morning, it had returned to normal. Orange flames, proper heat, wood that actually burned. But I couldn't shake the memory of those cold blue flames, or the way they'd seemed to pulse in rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. That same day, my compass stopped working. I'd been using it regularly to mark my position during supply runs to the creek and the small clearing where I'd hidden my ATV. The needle had always pointed true north, steady as a rock, but now it spun lazily in circles, occasionally stopping to point in directions that made no sense. Sometimes it pointed toward the cabin when I was standing outside it. Sometimes it pointed straight up at the sky. I tried every compass I had, 3 in total, and they all behaved the same way. The GPS unit I kept for emergencies was equally useless, showing my location as a shifting point that jumped randomly across the map, sometimes placing me in Nevada, sometimes in Colorado, once showing me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The topology itself seemed to be changing. Paths I'd walked dozens of times now led to different destinations. The creek that flowed past my cabin had always run west toward the valley mouth, but now it seemed to flow in a gentle curve that brought it back on itself, creating an impossible loop. The stand of aspen trees where I'd cut firewood was sometimes 50 yards from the cabin, sometimes 200, depending on which direction I approached from. I began marking trees with my knife, carving simple X's to help navigate, but the marks would shift and change. Sometimes they'd be higher on the trunk than I'd carved them. Sometimes they'd appear on trees I'd never touched. Once I found my mark carved into the side of a massive boulder that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The isolation was getting to me. I knew that. 8 months of solitude could play tricks on anyone's mind, but the evidence was undeniable. Something was wrong with this place, or something was making it wrong. Then Marcus showed up. I heard the ATV engine long before I saw him. the sound echoing off the valley walls in a way that seemed both too loud and strangely muffled. I hadn't seen another human being in over a month, and the sudden intrusion of civilization sent my heart racing. I grabbed my shotgun, my rifle was still missing, and waited by the door. The man who emerged from the tree line was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and clothes that looked expensive but well worn. He had the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge, and when he smiled, I felt an automatic distrust that I couldn't quite explain. "Kenneth Young," he called out, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm a private investigator." My blood went cold. The legal troubles I'd fled weren't entirely behind me. Civil suits, insurance investigations, angry investors who wanted their money back. I kept the shotgun ready but didn't point it directly at him. "You're trespassing," I said. "This is private land." "Actually, it's not," Marcus replied, his smile never wavering. "This is federal wilderness, but that's not why I'm here. I'm investigating some disappearances in this area. Hikers, campers, a few locals, all in the past 6 months, all last seen somewhere within a 20-mile radius of this valley." He pulled a tablet from his backpack and showed me photos. 5 different people, ranging in age from early 20s to middle-aged. 2 men, 3 women, all with the healthy outdoor look of experienced hikers. "Have you seen any of these people?" he asked. I studied the faces carefully. They meant nothing to me, but something about Marcus's presence felt wrong. Not just unwelcome, wrong in the same way the footprints and the spinning compass were wrong. "No," I said. "I haven't seen anyone out here except you. Mind if I look around? Won't take long." I did mind, but saying so would only make him more suspicious. I nodded reluctantly and watched as he began examining the area around my cabin. He seemed to know what he was looking for, checking the ground with practiced efficiency, photographing certain spots with his phone. "Interesting tracks," he said, crouching beside the circle of bare footprints that surrounded my cabin. "Very interesting." "Bare," I lied. "We get a lot of them through here." Marcus looked up at me with an expression that suggested he wasn't buying it. "This is no bear track, Kenneth. This is something else entirely, something that's been making people disappear." He stood up and dusted off his knees. "I'll be camping nearby tonight, just across the ridge. If you see or hear anything unusual, fire a shot into the air. I'll come running." I wanted to tell him to leave, to get in his ATV and drive back to whatever city had sent him, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I watched him disappear into the forest with his camping gear, heading in the direction of Devil's Backbone Ridge. That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. I woke to find frost covering everything, including the inside of my windows. My breath misted in the air, and when I checked the thermometer mounted outside my door, it read 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The weather report I'd heard on my emergency radio 3 days earlier had predicted lows in the 40s. The cold was unnatural, biting and sharp in a way that seemed to cut through my heaviest jacket. But worse than the cold was the silence. Complete, absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. No wind, no animal sounds, no distant hum of insects. Even my own heartbeat seemed muffled. I built up the fire, normal fire this time, and huddled close to it with my coffee waiting for dawn. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Marcus screaming. The sound carried clearly through the frigid air, a long, desperate wail that rose and fell like a siren. It came from the direction of Devil's Backbone Ridge, and it went on for what felt like hours. Not continuous screaming, but periodic bursts separated by terrible silence, as if something was taking its time with him. I grabbed my shotgun and headed toward the sound, but I couldn't find it. The screaming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the valley walls in impossible ways. I'd walk toward what sounded like the source, only to have the sound shift and seem to come from behind me. After an hour of stumbling through the dark forest, I gave up and returned to my cabin. The screaming stopped just before dawn. I waited until full daylight before heading toward Marcus's camp, following the tracks his ATV had made the day before. But the tracks led to a dead end, a sheer cliff face that definitely hadn't been there when he'd passed through. There was no way around it, no sign of where the tracks continued. Marcus was gone, as if he'd never existed. But that night, he came back. I was eating a late dinner when I heard the ATV engine again, and that same slightly muffled sound echoing through the valley. I looked out the window and saw headlights approaching through the trees, moving slowly and deliberately toward my cabin. Marcus climbed off the ATV and walked to my door, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His gait was too stiff, too precise, like someone concentrating very hard on appearing normal. When he knocked, the sound was perfectly rhythmic. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, exactly repeated. "Kenneth," he called through the door. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." His voice sounded right, but there was something underneath it, like an echo that didn't quite match. I kept the shotgun ready and cracked the door open, keeping the chain latch engaged. Marcus stood in the porch light, but the illumination seemed to bend around him strangely, creating shadows that fell in the wrong directions. His smile was the same, but his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "Where have you been?" I asked. "I heard you screaming." "Screaming?" His head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a distant sound. "I wasn't screaming, Kenneth. I was calling for you." "Calling for me?" "You need to come with me. There's something you need to see, something about the people who've been disappearing." Every instinct I possessed was telling me not to open that door, not to trust the thing that looked like Marcus but moved like a puppet on strings. "I'm fine here," I said. "Whatever it is can wait until morning." "It can't wait." His smile never changed, but I could see too many teeth. "It has to be now, Kenneth, while the conditions are right." I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, backing away from the window. The knocking resumed immediately. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, and continued for over an hour. When it finally stopped, I crept to the window and looked out. Marcus, or the thing that looked like Marcus, was standing perfectly still in the center of my clearing, his back to the cabin. He stood there all night, unmoving despite the cold, and when dawn came, he simply wasn't there anymore. The ATV was gone too, leaving no tracks, no sign that either had ever existed. That was when I decided to leave. I'd planned to wait out the winter in my cabin, but whatever was happening here was escalating beyond my ability to handle. I packed my essential supplies, loaded my emergency gear, and prepared to hike out to the old mining road where I'd hidden my truck. The map that had guided me perfectly for 8 months now showed a completely different landscape. Trails I'd marked carefully were missing, replaced by topographical features that made no sense. The mining road was gone entirely, replaced by what appeared to be a large lake that definitely hadn't existed when I'd arrived. I tried using landmarks instead, distinctive rock formations and tree groups that I'd memorized during my supply runs. But they weren't where they should have been. The massive dead pine that had served as my primary navigation reference was now healthy and green, as if decades of decay had been reversed overnight. I spent 3 days trying to find a way out of the valley, covering ground that should have been familiar, but every path led me back to my cabin. Not similar areas, the exact same clearing, the exact same building, as if the forest itself was a maze designed to trap me. On the 4th morning, I woke to find my food supplies rotting. Everything, canned goods, dried meat, sealed packages, had somehow spoiled overnight. The cans were bloated and leaking, the dried food was covered in fuzzy black mold, and everything reeked of decay. Even the sealed water containers tasted like stagnant pond water. I was trapped with no food, no way out, and something in the forest that was pretending to be a dead private investigator. That night, it visited me again. Not Marcus this time. This time, it was Sarah, my ex-wife. She stood in the clearing outside my cabin, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to our wedding. Her hair perfectly styled despite the fact that she'd supposedly died in a car accident 6 months earlier. I knew she was dead. I'd read the obituary online during one of my last trips to town for supplies. But there she was, looking exactly as she had 15 years ago, before the lies and the stolen money and the bitter divorce that had destroyed everything we'd built together. "Kenneth," she called, her voice carrying the soft Tennessee accent that I'd fallen in love with. "Come out here, baby. I need to talk to you." I stayed inside, gripping my shotgun so tightly my knuckles ached. "You're dead, Sarah. I know you're dead." "Death isn't what you think it is out here," she replied. "Nothing is what you think it is. You've been chosen, Kenneth. Chosen to join us." "Us? All the people who've disappeared. We're still here, baby. We're all still here, waiting for you." Through the window, I could see figures emerging from the tree line. Dozens of them, maybe more, standing in a loose circle around my cabin. They looked human at first glance, but the longer I watched, the more wrong they became. Their proportions were subtly off, their movements too fluid, their eyes reflecting light like cat's eyes. "We know what you did," Sarah continued. "We know about the money, about the families you hurt, but that doesn't matter now. Nothing from before matters. Out here, you can start over. You can be clean." By doing what? By letting go. By stopping your fight against what's natural. The figures began moving closer, and I could see that some of them wore the faces of the missing hikers from Marcus's photos. But their bodies were wrong. Too tall, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. Fingers that stretched into claws when they thought I wasn't looking directly at them. "What are you?" I whispered. "We're what becomes of people who stay too long in places they don't belong," Sarah said. "We're what the forest makes of intruders who won't leave." I tried to leave. The forest won't let me. "Because you're not ready. You're still fighting what you are, what you've always been. A thief. A liar. A man who destroys everything he touches." Her words hit like physical blows, each one finding the guilt I'd tried so hard to bury. She was right, of course. I had stolen that money. I had lied to cover it up. I had destroyed my marriage, my career, and the lives of the investors who'd trusted me. "Come outside, Kenneth. Stop hiding from what you are." The figures were almost at my cabin now, their faces becoming clearer in the moonlight. I recognized Marcus among them, but his features kept shifting, as if his face was just a mask that didn't quite fit. Next to him stood a young woman who matched one of the missing hiker photos, but her head was tilted at an angle that would have broken her neck. "We're your family now," Sarah said. "Your real family. The family of those who've taken what they wanted and lived with the consequences." I found myself moving toward the door, my hand reaching for the deadbolt. There was a seductive logic to what she was saying. I had been running from my crimes, hiding in this wilderness like a coward. Maybe it was time to stop running, to accept what I'd become. My fingers touched the lock, and suddenly the temperature plummeted again. Frost spread across the inside of my windows like living ice, and my breath came out in thick clouds. The figures outside began changing, their human masks slipping away to reveal something underneath that my mind refused to process clearly. Sarah's beautiful face stretched and distorted, her mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Her blue dress became tattered and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. "Come out, Kenneth," she said, but her voice was now a harmony of whispers, as if dozens of people were speaking in unison. "Come out and feed us what you've kept hidden." I jerked my hand back from the door and raised the shotgun. "Get away from here." The laughter that followed was like breaking glass mixed with the sound of wind through dead leaves. The figures began circling the cabin, their movements becoming less human with each step. They walked on their hands as easily as their feet, their heads rotating completely around, their limbs extending and contracting like rubber. "You can't hide forever," the Sarah thing said. "We know where you are. We know what you fear. We know that you're already one of us. I'm not like you. Aren't you? You've been stealing from this forest for 8 months, taking its water, burning its wood, killing its animals. You're a thief here, just like you were there. The only difference is scale." The circle of creatures tightened around my cabin, and I could hear them scratching at the walls with claws that sounded like metal on wood. The scratching formed a rhythm, almost like Morse code, and after a few minutes I realized it was spelling out words: THIEF, LIAR, MURDERER. "Murderer," I said aloud. "I never killed anyone." "Didn't you?" The Seraphim pressed its face against my window, its features flowing like liquid. "What about old Mrs. Henderson, the one who invested her pension with your company? What about the young couple who lost their house? They trusted you, and you destroyed them. How is that different from murder?" More faces appeared at my windows. The missing hikers, but also people I recognized from my old life. Clients whose money I'd stolen, colleagues I'd betrayed, friends I'd abandoned when the investigation began. All of them had the same wrong proportions, the same predatory gleam in their eyes. "Let us in, Kenneth," they chanted together. "Let us in, and we'll make the guilt stop. We'll make everything stop." The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could hear wood splintering as their claws dug deeper into the cabin walls. The sound of my own panicked breathing filled the small space, mixing with the whispered promises coming from outside. I had 2 shells left in my shotgun, 2 shells against dozens of creatures that might not even be affected by bullets. I was going to die here, alone, and far from anything that mattered. Just another missing person for some future investigator to puzzle over. But then I remembered something Marcus had said. This is something that's been making people disappear. Not something that killed people. Something that made them disappear. Made them vanish without a trace, as if they'd never existed. The creatures outside weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to recruit me, to transform me into one of them, which meant they needed me alive, which meant they had limitations. I aimed the shotgun at the window where the Seraphim was pressed against the glass and pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the window and sent the creature reeling backward with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. The other figures froze for a moment, their attention focused on their injured companion, and in that instant of confusion, I saw my chance. I ran for the back door, the one that led toward the creek. If I could reach the water, maybe I could follow it downstream, away from whatever force was keeping me trapped in this valley. I hit the door at full speed, bursting out into the night air, and sprinted toward the sound of running water. Behind me, the creatures gave chase, but they moved wrong in the open. Too fast in some directions, too slow in others, as if they weren't quite sure how their stolen bodies were supposed to work. I reached the creek and splashed into the icy water, following its course as it wound between the trees. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt real in a way that nothing else had for days. The creek bed was solid under my feet, the current constant and logical. Whatever was wrong with this place, the water seemed to be exempt from it. I followed the creek for what felt like hours, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs, soaking myself to the skin in the near-freezing water. The sounds of pursuit faded behind me, replaced by the natural night sounds I'd missed. Owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. When dawn came, I found myself at the edge of the valley, standing beside a gravel road that definitely hadn't been there before. In the distance, I could see the lights of a small town, Duchesne, according to a weathered road sign. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it 8 months earlier, keys still hidden under the rear bumper. Everything in it was exactly as I'd left it, including the emergency supplies and the cell phone I'd kept for true emergencies. I started the engine with shaking hands and drove toward town, not looking back at the valley that had nearly claimed me. But in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of figures standing at the tree line, watching me leave. They looked human from a distance, but I knew better now. The Duchesne Sheriff's Office was a small building on the main street, staffed by a single deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I told him about the missing hikers, about Marcus Reed, about the strange things I'd seen in the forest. He took notes with obvious skepticism, but when I mentioned the names from Marcus's photos, his expression changed. "Those people have been missing for months," he said. "How do you know about them?" I told him about Marcus's visit, about his investigation, about the screaming I'd heard. The deputy made several phone calls and came back looking confused. "There's no Marcus Reed registered as a private investigator in Utah," he said, "or in any neighboring state, and, according to our records, no one by that name has filed any reports about missing persons in this area." I insisted that Marcus had shown me the photos, had told me about the disappearances. The deputy showed me the case files and the photos were there, the same 5 people Marcus had shown me, but there was no record of any private investigator being involved in the cases. "Look," the deputy said finally, "you've been living alone in the woods for 8 months. That can mess with a person's head. Maybe you should talk to someone, get yourself checked out." He was right, of course. 8 months of isolation could cause hallucinations, paranoid delusions, complete breaks from reality. Everything I'd experienced could be explained by psychological breakdown combined with the effects of extreme solitude. But that didn't explain the photos. It didn't explain how I'd known about the missing hikers before the deputy showed me the files. And it didn't explain the GPS coordinates I'd written down, coordinates that marked the exact location of my valley, a place that officially didn't exist on any map. I drove to the nearest city, Salt Lake City, and checked myself into a hotel. I showered for the first time in weeks, ate my first hot meal, slept in my first real bed. I told myself that everything was going to be normal now, that I'd escaped whatever psychological hell I'd created for myself in the wilderness. But 3 days later, Sarah called me. I was sitting in a coffee shop trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life when my cell phone rang. The number was one I recognized. Sarah's old cell phone, the one that should have been disconnected when she died. "Kenneth," her voice said when I answered, clear as if she was sitting across from me. "You left us." "You're dead," I whispered. "This isn't real." "Death isn't what you think it is," she replied, just like she had outside my cabin. "And neither is distance. You can run as far as you want, baby, but you'll always be one of us now. You've seen too much, taken too much. The forest has marked you." I hung up and threw the phone in a trash can, but I could still hear her laughing. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been driving, staying in different motels every night, never staying in one place long enough for anything to find me. But they always do. I see them in crowds, people with faces that shift when I'm not looking directly at them. I see them in reflections, standing behind me when there's no one there. I hear them calling my name from empty rooms, whispering promises through thin hotel walls. The worst part is that I'm starting to want what they're offering. The guilt is eating me alive, just like it did in the cabin, and the idea of letting go, of stopping the constant weight of what I've done, becomes more tempting every day. I know I can't run forever. I know that eventually I'll have to go back to that valley, back to the things that are waiting for me there. Because Sarah was right about one thing. I am a thief. I've been stealing from the world my entire life, taking what doesn't belong to me and leaving nothing but damage in my wake. Maybe it's time to pay what I owe. Maybe it's time to stop running and accept what I've always been. The forest is calling me back, and I can feel my resistance weakening with each passing day. Soon, I'll drive north toward Utah, toward the Uintas Mountains, toward a valley that doesn't exist on any map but exists in my dreams every night. When I do, I won't be coming back. If you're reading this, if someone finds this account in whatever hotel room I finally abandon, don't go looking for me. Don't try to find that valley. Some places are meant to remain lost, and some debts are meant to be paid in ways that the living shouldn't witness. The creatures there aren't evil exactly. They're just honest about what they are, what they take, what they cost. In a world full of people like me, people who lie and steal and destroy, maybe that honesty is exactly what we deserve. I can hear them calling now, even here in this roadside motel in Nevada. They sound like wind through the trees, like Sarah's laughter, like the whispered promises of a life without guilt. They're coming for me tonight. I can feel it, and I think I'm finally ready to let them take me home.